looking at Rose to make sure that the streaming on YouTube is now gone live, which is brilliant. Okay, so anybody who does want to watch that, just go to Responsible Raw Materials channel on YouTube and you will see that it is now streaming live. So I have, what you will need to do, however, though, is to mute one of your microphones, otherwise you'll get a really horrible echo effect, which is horrific, and does all kinds of nasty things to the soul. So, ladies and gentlemen, it has just gone 3 o'clock from my perspective. Also as well, we are recording, which is brilliant. Okay, Rose, for some reason, I can't record on my end, but that's all okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this year's Responsible Raw Materials Conference. This year, we're really excited to bring to you a wide variety of talks from some phenomenal speakers, all of whom will be looking at how do we make environment, social and governance, or sustainability, or license to operate, whatever you want to call it, how do we actually make it a reality? Many conferences have been held over the past year looking at what does sustainability mean with regards to the mining sector, but also responsible sourcing. So how do we actually ensure that all of those raw materials that we need that come from the ground beneath our feet, or indeed are of course recycled, how do we make sure we source these and use these in the most responsible manner? Now, this year's conference is all about how do we do it? So it assumes that we all think doing it responsibly is a good idea. Okay, and so this is the next step. This is all of us coming together and saying, how do we make this a reality? Now, what you will have hopefully seen is on our website, and if you haven't seen the website yet, I'm sure that Ellen or Rose will pop the website address into chat at the moment. You will see that we have a little infographic. And this infographic allows us to explore some of the different stakeholders, but also some of the different tools that can be used to make ESG a reality. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to share my screen so you can see this infographic, and also the website, just in case you haven't found it yet. So what you see here is, of course, this array of stakeholders for responsible raw materials and responsible sourcing. It doesn't just lie with the mining companies or with the procurement departments. It doesn't just lie with governments. It doesn't just lie with NGOs or environmental specialists or academics or innovators or activists. All of us need to be able to come together and share what we're doing so that together we can push and pull responsible raw materials in the right direction to ensure that we look after the land from which we are extracting these raw materials, but also ensure that mining is a sustainable endeavor that will be able to carry on into the future. So, what have we got planned for you lovely people this week? Well, as you can see, we are using Zoom as the main channel. And so we're using Zoom webinars. I am pretty sure almost everybody has used a Zoom webinar at some point in time in the last 12 months. This time 12 months ago, we had to do quite a lot of teaching people how to use Zoom. This year, we have received no questions with regards to using Zoom. And I think that might be one of the positive things perhaps to come from 12 months of all of us being in lockdown and now being experts in terms of video conferencing. So with regards to all of this, you guys will note that along the bottom of your screens, you've got the ability to ask Q&As. Okay, so the Q&A button is there for you to be able to ask questions all the way through the conference. Feel free to ask questions of our fabulous speakers as and when you're listening to their talks, because there's 10 minutes of question time after all of their talks. Also, feel free to ask questions in general, because we have all week to be able to address these and all week to be able to explore everybody's different perspectives, different ideas, and different concerns with regards to how do we make ESG in raw materials a reality. We've also got the chat function, which is open and free for the moment. So thank you very much to all of you who have already started chatting away. That is absolutely fantastic. I was about to say fantabulous. I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of me making up words. Let's see how we get on as we go through the week. Do feel free to pose your comments, suggestions, ideas in chat as well, and we can get the discussion going there. We will be leaving chat open throughout the conference, unless, of course, somebody is a little bit naughty, and then we will start just to constrain on people's ability to talk freely. Within Responsible Raw Materials, we do welcome everybody's ideas and suggestions, but we would please implore with all of you just to keep everything clean and respectful of one another as well. Because, of course, we want to push the discussion further forwards rather than be nasty to one another, because that doesn't necessarily push the discussion forwards very well. So we've got chat, we've got Q&A if you're with us on Zoom. If you are with us, we're in YouTube, please feel free to use the chat in YouTube as well to pose questions to us. And I can see that we've got a number of people who have already started watching us in YouTube. Don't feel left out. YouTubers, please do feel free to ask us questions in YouTube, because we will pull them into our discussion and our Q&A sessions with our fantastic speakers. If for some reason you don't want to ask us questions in Q&A or in chat on Zoom or via the chat in YouTube, and you prefer Twitter or LinkedIn or the website, we are keeping an eye on those channels as well. So do feel free to comment on what you're hearing, ask us questions in that, and we'll keep an eye on all of this as well. So in terms of those being the channels for our discussion, which will hopefully be as two-way as we possibly can, or embracing of as many different perspectives and opinions as possible, just to give you a little whistle-stop tour of the website. So what do we have here? So in the website, so just responsiblerawmaterials.com. So if I just hit the home button, okay, this is of course the home page. Then you can either click on Learn More to go to the conference, or you can click on the 2021 ESG Toolbox conference tab, and that will take you to the main conference page. If you want to stream live on YouTube, of course, you can click on the YouTube button. If you want to implore any of your colleagues or your friends or your family to sign up, please do feel free to get them to sign up by clicking on the sign up button. This will be left open throughout the week, unless Rose tells me that I've got that wrong, and then I will correct my instructions with regards to that. We also have the infographic. Feel free to use the infographic if you think it would be useful in anything that you're doing. We know that a number of universities have already made use of this over the past week. This is something that we will be updating this week as more ideas and more stakeholders, for example, get added to our little toolbox that we are putting together here. So this is freely available for everybody to make use of. Also on the website, you will see the schedule, and this schedule has changed ever so slightly over the last week. But in summary, we have talks that are being delivered, or interviews being delivered, from 81 different people based all over the world across a multitude of different time zones, different latitudes. It's all very exciting. In each session, we have a wide variety of different speakers. So our sessions are not themed. Okay, instead, what we've very intentionally done is mix everybody up so that we get a wide variety of different ideas and perspectives within each session. And hopefully we then spark some really interesting discussions, not just between the speakers, but also, of course, between all of you who have dialed in as attendees with regards to the discussion, and also the ultimate tools and techniques that we want to share with one another, through which we make ESG a reality. So you've got the schedule that's here, and you will be able to download that. We'll have a downloadable version of that by the end of today's session available for you. But it doesn't stop there. Oh no, our lovely speakers have been brilliant, and almost all of them have submitted a fantastic abstract. So if you want to see what your favorite speakers are going to be speaking about, please click on the little Here button. Okay, and that will take you to this page here. Okay, if that made you feel slightly ill, yes, I think it made Rose feel slightly ill, because Rose has been the person behind pulling all of this together. So well done, Rose. What you can find on this page is the talk, or the title of the talk for each speaker, plus down below it, here we have all of the different speakers themselves, including their abstract that they have submitted to us. So if I click on Amanda's abstract, for example, Amanda will be talking to us, I think on Thursday morning, and you can see here she's been brilliant, and she's provided us with a bit of an abstract, some background to herself and her organization as well. So you can see a bit more about what Amanda gets up to and what she's all about, which is great. If for some reason you are finding it difficult to navigate this, which, to be completely honest, that is very justifiable, because we have lots of talks now that have come together. A different way of searching the abstracts is actually by clicking on the talks page. And this will take you to a part of the website that includes not only the talks that we will be listening to this year, only one of which has been pre-recorded. Everything else is going to be delivered 100% live. Okay, so bear with us if things do go slightly wrong. But what we have here includes all of the abstracts for this year's conference, but we also have lots of talks from last year as well. So, for example, within this, if you click on the search button and you type in Amanda, okay, hopefully we will be able to find, there we go. So there's Amanda's abstract that we just saw. Okay, so that is one way of finding those abstracts. But also, say, for example, you are really excited by Cobalt, okay, or something like that. You should be able to click on Cobalt. And here we have Richard Harrington, who spoke to us about diversifying cobalt supplies this time last year. If I click on his abstract, you will see that his video from last year is there in the abstract, together with his abstract and his biography as well. So if having lots of hours worth of live conference isn't enough for you this week, you can fill in the rest of your day by watching the videos from last year as well. Can't you, Rose? Isn't that fantastic? It is indeed, exactly. So there's lots and lots of information there for you. Please do feel free to explore that in lots of detail. Also on the website as well, you will find a whole myriad of other learning resources, all of which take you into different ways in which we can make responsible raw materials a reality. One final thing to mention with this is that earlier on this year, we did host a number of roundtables, specifically with regards to resource and reserves, so mineral resources and reserves. If you haven't seen this, please do feel free to go and take a look. Some of the wonderful team that was involved in this even condensed all of the roundtables into a 5-minute teaser trailer. So if you want to see what is happening in the world of the mineral or the rock resources and reserves, feel free to go and take a look at that as well. It's only 5 minutes, and that will give you an update as to what's happening in that world, which is brilliant, even if you're not someone who enjoys the beauty of all of the wonderful rocks. So if we just go back to our conference page again, so that is where, of course, you can watch everything live on YouTube. You've got the infographic there, you've got the schedules there, and the link across to all of the abstracts. Something else to mention is that this conference doesn't just stop on Friday lunchtime, okay, UK time. No, instead it's going to go on for another few weeks through the mode of a number of training sessions. And we've been incredibly fortunate to get the sponsorships from some brilliant organizations, and their sponsorship has gone to paying for things like the Zoom license for this conference that we're running here today and this week, but also the sponsorship has gone into paying for lots of free seats on these training courses that you can see advertised here on the screen in front of you. So if you are interested yourself, or if you have colleagues or friends who are interested in learning more about responsible mining and sourcing, or an introduction to mining, or integrated risk management in mining, to name but a few, please do feel free to get in touch with us. We do have some seats still available on these courses. In fact, we have lots of seats still available on these courses because we've only opened them properly today, haven't we, Ellen? So if anybody is interested in grabbing one of those seats, please get in touch with Ellen. She will put her email address in the chat at the moment. It is just ellen@satala.com. So Ellen will be coordinating all of that behind the scenes. We keep the courses nice and small, so you will be joining just 15 people, or you'll be joining 14 other people, I should say, just to get my maths right. So they're nice little courses, and they each consist of 6 hours in total, 3 hours across so 3 hours on one day, 3 hours on the next day. And so during those sessions, you will get to meet and interact with lots of other people who work within the sector. But the courses are also nice and small. So there's lots of space for you to be able to discuss and ask lots of questions of your trainer. So those are the training courses that we've got. And then finally, just to give a big shout out to our sponsors. I know that we've got some more sponsors that have come in just today. So if you don't see your logo there and you think your logo should be there, then please let Rose or myself know, and we will be able to post that immediately on the website and give you a massive, massive thank you, because without our sponsors, we wouldn't be able to run the conference in the way that you will be seeing through the course of this week. So just before we get cracking for this afternoon session, if I just go back to our schedule, what have we got lined up for you this week? Well, as I mentioned, this week is all about the ESG Toolbox, or the Environment, Social and Governance Toolbox. So it is all about trying to make ESG a reality. That's what we're trying to do here. Now, in terms of those tools and techniques, they can come from anything from mining companies who may have developed their own approaches. They might come from academics and little tech startups, for example, who have also got their own ways of approaching this. Of course, many different consultancies operate in this space, all of whom offer fantastic tools and techniques to help us ensure that we can better manage all of those social, environment, and governance opportunities and threats that we might face. But we can't do it with just that array of people. We also need the world of finance, for example, to come to the table. And we've seen a dramatic change in this over the last 12 months, which is really exciting, where sustainable finance and responsible finance have actually put in place some mechanisms through which we really are seeing the accountability in terms of where finance is being allocated, i.e. which companies that finance is being allocated to or invested in. Are we seeing sustainability properly being used as one of the criteria that is used when an organisation decides where to invest? And we're going to hear later on today from Dr. Paul Pritchard a little bit about one of the big changes that we've seen, certainly in the UK and Europe, with regards to TCFD, so carbon disclosure and the requirements of financial services in this part of the world. So we've got people from finance and insurance. We've also got people from governments and the policy and regulator setters. So, for example, on Thursday morning, we have a member of the British Parliament, Alexander Stafford, who's going to be talking to us about the UK's minerals strategy. Now, in the UK, actually, it has been a very exciting 18 months, because this time 18 months ago, the UK was still part of Europe. Okay, and then of course this thing called Brexit happened that actually has led to really quite exciting discussions happening in the UK, where prior to Brexit, the UK didn't really need a mineral strategy, for example, because we were part of Europe, whereas now the UK is of course separate. And so you've seen lots of really exciting conversations being had in many different forums across the country and actually globally as well, looking at what does the United Kingdom need in terms of that mineral strategy. Also from that government aspect as well, happening later on this month, we have the G7, which is taking place or being hosted by the UK. And then in November, COVID depending, we have COP26 as well. So there's an awful lot of exciting bits and pieces that have been happening in the UK. So we've got government, we've got finance, we've got regulators, we've got NGOs, mining activists, mining companies, academics, innovators, etc., all coming together to share their ideas. And we also have, right in the middle of the week, we've got a session on Wednesday morning, which is entitled Bursting the Bubble. And by that, we mean what goes on outside of our raw materials bubble, because we're all acutely aware that it's very easy to think that the entire world thinks like us, because all of us work inside raw materials. And so what we've done on Wednesday is invite some very, very brave individuals to come and join us. And these people come from outside of the raw materials world, and they are going to be answering some questions posed by Åsa Borsen, who we're very lucky to have with us. And they're going to be exploring what do they think raw materials is all about, given that none of them actually happen to work within mining, within policy setting, within financial aspects of raw materials. So what does it actually mean to them? This is with an aim of looking outside of all of the usual discussions that we typically have, hence the reason why we're calling it bursting the bubble. So final things to mention before we get cracking with our first talk for this afternoon, and that is you will notice that each session starts with a welcome and recap. Some of those sessions also start with an interview with a fantastic person, and that is brilliant. That's because a number of people have contacted us over the last week asking if they can take part in the conference, and so we've managed to sneak them in there into the welcome and recap slots. Each day then goes into a whole series of talks, or each session goes into a series of talks. Those talks will be 10 minutes of talking, followed by 10 minutes of questions. And we really do welcome everybody to feed in as many questions as possible. And then every session will finish with a panel. And during that panel, we will typically be joined by yet another speaker who will give us their insight as to either what they've heard or also their feelings about different tools and techniques that can be used for ESG. But also those speakers that will still be with us, will invite them to turn their cameras and their microphones on again and engage in that final 30-minute discussion before we close out that session for today. So this conference is all about openness. It is all about sharing ideas. It's about challenging one another. And at the end of the day, trying to collate together that toolbox of ideas, tools, techniques, tips, and approaches through which we can make ESG a reality within the raw materials space. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the first speaker that we have. And whilst I realise that the entirety of this conference is going to be fully live, unfortunately, our first speaker has come down with, or his family recently came down with that dreaded thing called COVID-19. So he's unfortunately at this precise second in time at the doctor's with one of the members of his family. We're assured that everybody is okay. It is not a nasty version of the dreaded COVID-19. But Tobias Kindrieper has been absolutely fantastic, and he did actually pre-record his talk with us over the weekend. And so what I'm going to do is invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to please put your hands together for Tobias's talk. I'm going to share it on my screen and hit play. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to welcome from the WWF for you to open our conference today, taking a look specifically at that environmental side of ESG. I welcome Tobias Kindrieper. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tobias Kindrieper. I'm the global lead on mining and metals within WWF. We are looking into environmental and social impacts along the supply chain of various commodities. To showcase who we are. WWF is one of the world leading and biggest environmental and conservation NGOs in the world. We were founded in 1961. We have about 100 offices around the globe with a lot of employees and supporters, as you can see on the screen. And today I would love to get into the part about climate change vulnerability of mining for the mining sector itself, what climate change means for the sector. And I highlighted that today as an example for the copper industry. As you all are aware, copper plays a huge role for the energy transition, as well as for issues such as e-mobility and so on and so forth. And what we can see is has been a study done by the Environmental Agency in Germany about climate change vulnerability assessments for the mining sector, and this one is especially on the copper issues. We can see that a different kind of risk related to climate change, which is on exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity of certain countries where copper mining plays a big role. Obviously, the biggest country for copper mining is Chile, afterwards Peru, China, USA, and obviously Australia, DRC, Zambia, and other countries as well. And in those, they were ranked within these components of the vulnerability for the mining sector. And we can see that there are different kind of problems, so to call, in the DRC and in Zambia, for example, exposure due to climate change is quite big. The exposure means the extent of which human society is supporting the sector and stressed by the future challenging on the climate change conditions. And this, for example, is not so much an issue in Chile, but it is in the DRC and Zambia. We can see as well that the sensitivity, the degree to which people and the sector they depend on are affected by climate-related perturbations are actually quite high as well in countries such as Zambia, and not so much in Chile. What this basically shows, and I don't want to get into much detail, is that there is a huge vulnerability for the sector itself across the different kind of countries we are talking about, and there are overall a high-ranked vulnerability for those, especially in countries such as Peru, as well as China, DRC, and Zambia. And this obviously plays a big importance as well for the questions on financing it, and to look into what actually this means for the sector itself, where to put money in, and what kind of components are important in terms of the overall vulnerability for the sector. In the terms of our focusing on different kind of issues related to those, as you know, WWF is quite big when it comes to climate issues, to forestation and deforestation issues, as well as biodiversity. And another part, which is quite a big one in our work across sectors, so not only in the mining sector itself, is water and water risk. So-called water stewardship angles and work we do on that. We have a tool called the Water Risk Filter tool, where we have different kind of companies, registered and looking into what their water risk related to their, company and site level is. We have companies such as Starbucks, H&M, Google, Target, and IKEA using that tool to look into what kind of, risks their exposure on their site. And we can see that, first of all, we did that with the mining sector. And I think this is quite interesting for the conference on raw materials today, is there are three different kind of, risk. Obviously, the physical risk is one, which I just explained in the previous slide. The regulatory risk, I think a lot of colleagues here in this call will see that as well when it comes to issues related to mining and operations on site, with weak law enforcement, with weak mining codes and implementation of those laws. And the last point is reputational risk, which obviously is also quite a big issue when it comes to the tailing dam break, for example, in Brazil in 2019. In those water risk related scenarios, as we call them, we did an analysis on the mining sector itself. And what you can see in those slides, or in this particular slide, is that we ranked them the overall water risk related to different kind of commodities, which is quite interesting. And one of the biggest, risk related to that is the commodity of coal, as well as palladium and bauxite. And we can look into this detail and what kind of risks are related to that. And I just want to highlight that, because water plays a huge role, especially when I just explained the copper part, as well as copper is a huge part of the, of the financing and the business case of a copper mine. So this water risk, which is the front line of climate risk, is incredibly important to understand that, because it's first of all about the scarcity issue, and then it comes with the business case, as well as due to the climate change, the flooding of events, where we have seen that already in eastern parts of Australia, where flooding of mining sites and exposure to those mining sites been a huge risk to that areas and to those sectors as well. So what the tool can do is support those, looking into what those risks are and actually give guidance on how to change those and mitigate those in the ideal world, obviously. And we need to start thinking about landscape level solutions and nature-based solutions that can not only help tackle the climate crisis, but also begin to enhance resilience on water issues. So this is something I wanted to talk about, and to give a kind of short last point on that. Just to get everything together in the end is obviously, in my point of view, the one of the biggest solution which we can all look into, the sense of having a decrease in primary commodity and increase in secondary ones, is a circular economy approach. And I show that picture quite regularly because I like it, even though there are some discussions about the numbers. So don't get me too much in detail about that, because they could be discussed. But the sense of it is the right way. Is about how much actually we lose within the supply chain and the value chain of copper in that case. And this is applicable for a lot of other commodities within the sector, whether it's bauxite, whether it's iron ore and others, that we're losing two different kind of parts in the value and supply chain. Those commodities, in that part, we can see, quite frankly, in the end as well, big times on waste separation and on scrap collection. So what we do need is circular economy approaches, which stick in the first part and are the heart of the company's achievements. And with that, obviously, the decarbonization impacts and the decarbonization and climate change and climate adaptation plans and management plans that are involved in that will have a bigger value and a bigger impact. Circular economy approaches are actually tackled and enclosed in the governance of each entity working on that. There are other parts, obviously, which I haven't talked about in so much detail today. I've seen that there are already a lot of others who will talk about science-based targets, about the question on future knowledge and skills, open innovation, and so on and so forth. So I think that is quite the way to go forward with comprehensive ESG screening that includes science-based targets for climate, nature, modern slavery. Finance sector and stakeholder pressure needs to be involved. And I want to thank you again for having me. And I'm happy to stay in touch, and please send me with the contact details you see there, an email, and happy to answer that and get in contact with you. Thank you very much, and stay healthy. Bye.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Tobias. That is absolutely fantastic. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause from the other side of your muted microphones. So thank you very, very much for that, sir. Just a couple of questions, if I may. So the first thing is, so your water risk filter tool, which you just showed us there, is that something that is freely available for people to be able to log in and play with, or how do people get access to it?
Yeah, so we have about 6,500 entities using it every day, and it's applicable. It's an open source data set. When it comes into the site-specific parts of a company, this is not shared, obviously. So this is something you have to get into and log in and actually get also kind of an access, which then has to be discussed with our water risk filter team. There are a lot of other tools with that. For example, the resilience and kind of the, how can I call it, the kind of outlook to 2030, 2050, with the CBD and different kind of SDG levels and parts to connect that with each of every company's core corporate values that needs to be then adjusted, obviously, for each entity. But this is obviously something you should be discussing with the people who are interested in it, and I get you in contact with our water risk filter team.
Fantastic. I'm sure that there'll be some people who will be doing that right now, actually, in terms of finding it online, etc., and getting in contact, because it looks fantastic. Secondly, I mean, you mentioned, obviously decarbonisation and the fact that recycling can't do everything. There's actually a lot of kind of leakiness, as it were, within the circular economy. Do you want to just highlight some of the things that different people within the conference perhaps ideally should be doing to help WWF meet the objectives that you're setting here? So what are some of the tangible actions that you hope to be seeing from across the world in terms of tightening up that circular economy with regards to, say, copper or raw materials in general?
Sure. Thank you very much for that question, Sarah. I mean, the first point, and this is kind of, we talk with a lot of different kind of sectors. And the first starting point I urge every company is to actually know where the commodity is coming from, right? This is a starting point, and we know how difficult that is, especially when we have artisanal and small scale issues involved in those supply chains. It's not, a soft commodity metal, so it's really hard to follow up and just to see where it comes from, even though there's some technologies at the moment, but this is actually quite expensive. So you need to know what your risks are related to the area you are sourcing from. And if you don't know that, you can't actually mitigate those risks, and those are different, right? The copper sourcing from Chile is a huge freshwater issue in terms of freshwater scarcity. If you source from Zambia, there are totally different issues involved, especially deforestation, biodiversity loss, and human rights and regulation risks related to that. So that's the first thing I would urge every company to get into, know where your commodity is coming from. The second part is also the importance of the governance and the sales team and the purchasing team to have the whether it's SDG or other kind of international sustainability parts as your heart in your heart of your strategy, right? So if you don't have that whole ESG thinking up to higher management, it's really difficult to only fulfill that kind of supply chain angle within your sustainability team. It has to come from the up top and has to be involved in the total process of the company, including purchasing and sales and your supplier and tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So this is something which goes way further, and this needs to be done by the whole company itself.
Great. So there's that actually taking accountability in a way for where you're buying your materials from, but then also looking for that true governance and I guess culture within the organization that means it when they talk about sustainability. Would that be right?
That would totally be right. Exactly. And that, it depends on your application, but we can see that the consumers and the consumer-facing companies have been more under pressure to actually know where it comes from. I remember that we had discussion with car industry companies as well as ICT sectors 5 years ago, and some of them didn't get any email about where their commodity is coming from. Where's the iron ore coming from? I can tell you now that when it comes to lithium, when it comes to other commodities, there are way more emails and way more social media connections to the companies in the automotive sector, as well as to the ICT, to actually ask them where do they come from, and they want to buy that. So there's changing demand side from consumers as well, and this is something which goes down to the upstream companies of those mining companies. They want to sell those more responsible minerals because there's a market for that. This is something I think everybody should be thinking about.
Great. So it's that kind of increased focus and I guess quality when it comes to knowing about the provenance of these materials, etc. So one final question, if I may, which is on the financing side. So obviously there's been quite massive change, or at least increased focus in terms of, okay, how do we ensure that money is actually being invested or lent, for example, in a sustainable manner, or to companies that are acting in more sustainable and responsible ways. Do you have any comments with regards to that angle?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I mean, this is a difficult topic. I think the finance sector, we can see that in terms, again, it depends on what kind of impacts you want to look into, right? I mean, the social impacts are different one than the environmental ones, even though they are combined together. Environmental right is a social right, but I think we can see that there's a lot of de-investment, obviously, in the whole fossil fuels sector, but there's also huge de-invest in companies who are not following socialized things to operate, who are not following criteria such as FPIC. We've seen, the issues in Western Australia with a company being exposed by the financial sector and the investors of those companies, and actually the CEO had to step down. So this is something, this is an example, and this is happening in a lot of other countries. We can see that in South America with different kind of companies at the moment. So this is the part we can see that investors and stakeholders looking more into this question of ESG in the sense of where are risks related to that, and they won't finance it. It's not as easy as it was, I guess, in some areas to get finance for a mining site when, FPIC, social license to operate, have not been involved, and actually multi-stakeholder approaches with the communities haven't been involved. And the last point as well in financing, as it's also a lot of public funding comes into that. We can see governments are moving, and especially in the European Union, when we can see the regulation about, the batteries regulation coming up, the conflict minerals regulation already is there, and then the supply chain due diligence process within the European Union, and this all tackles as well investment, right? And obviously the green taxonomy in the European Union, and all of that, I think, shapes together also the questions which were influenced by the finance sector itself to look really deep into how to invest sustainable and more responsible.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Tobias. And the good news for everybody is actually a lot of what Tobias has just said. We've got talks on things like FPIC, so free and prior informed consent. So if this is new to you, don't worry. There is a talk for you later on this week. And actually later on this afternoon, we're hearing for some fantastic speakers who are going to be talking about TCFD. So that's all about finance and carbon. And then also hearing from the insurance sector as well. So things that are going on in that avenue. So with that, thank you so much, Tobias. Really good to see you. Thank you very much for doing this pre-recorded video. It's the only one we're doing, but I hope everybody stays healthy. Thank you very much. Round of applause for Tobias, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Brilliant. So yes, there we go. And I think I'm just about managing to wear the same clothes as I wore in that video. So it was almost seamless. And my apologies, ladies and gentlemen, for hitting the mute button at the beginning of that talk. If you want to hear Tobias's proper introduction to himself and his background, his video will be appearing straight away on the website as soon as we finish today's session. But you will, of course, be able to find him on LinkedIn as well. So, and our hearts go out to Tobias and his family, and hope they're all recovering from COVID nicely. But to go from a pre-record session to a very much a live session. So the lovely Susan Joyce. So Susan, if you want to come off mute and start to share your slides. So Susan joins us from the beautiful Vancouver Island. And whilst Tobias shared with us some of the insights on the environmental sides of ESG, Susan will be sharing with us what does the S actually mean within the ESG side of things. So Susan, just while you are sharing those slides, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the wonderful Susan Joyce. Thank you very much. Off you go, Susan.
Appreciate that, Sarah, and good afternoon, good morning to everybody, depending on where you are. Tobias really did set the scene and touch on such a broad range of issues, and it's wonderful to hear that comprehensive a start. What I'm going to do is look a little bit more at sort of demythologizing the social side, and looking at what I think is fundamental to managing it, which is keeping it solidly grounded in an understanding of what has to be managed to manage social risk in ESG. And to start off, so I'm Susan Joyce. I am president of Uncommon Ground Consultants, a specialist social performance consulting company based here in Vancouver, but I'm speaking today on behalf of the Social Practice Forum, which is a collaborative of 65 social performance experts, social practice experts who have come together to create a forum in which we can really push forward the practice, social performance, and look at professionalizing it, improving an understanding of what's involved, and really move the bar in terms of what is the integration of social performance within industry, within business, as a key to effectively managing these issues. The forum works collaboratively. We pool, extensive years, decades of expertise that have come together to collectively work on the belief that business, civil society, communities, and government can transform natural resource endowments to create enduring and positive social, environmental, and economic outcomes. And what have been over the last 3 decades as we've worked on this, what are some of the barriers that we need to overcome to move to doing this effectively? So I'm speaking today for the Social Practice Forum. And the social as a component of ESG is perhaps it has not had the visibility until, say, the last couple of years that it's beginning to receive today, but it's also it's extremely broad. It covers a wide range of issues, and it tends to be much less understood. So we're going to talk a little bit about putting some substance to that. And one of the ways that we see this is some, at times, very strange understandings of what the S actually stands for in ESG. And if you do, we've done several extensive benchmarking studies and looking at how different companies are using the term social or using the term ESG on their websites and how it's being talked about online by different pundits. And there's a wide range of understanding of what it means. I'm going to get us to focus through this talk on what I consider to be the critical tool for effectively managing social risk, and that is a social performance approach and an increasingly professionalized and skilled application by experts, by professionals of what the social performance means. So the state of play is that there's an incredible range in the maturity of how organizations and companies address or understand ESG, from very sophisticated, well-developed approaches by equator banks that have been dealing with this for several decades at this point, and mining companies that have taken this on seriously and integrated it, to the incredible range of ways in which ESG is being talked about by companies that have come newly to it and that don't necessarily understand or embrace the core issues that have to be addressed. Now, there's been a huge explosion in the use of the term, and in particular around ESG investing. And the focus of ESG investing is really about disclosure and accountability. And it's an incredibly important driver that is, I think, reminding many mining companies and other actors of some of the commitments that were first made in the late 1990s as part of the Global Mining Initiative. And there was a big move toward more responsible performance. And then there was a slipping back through a lot of the work in the last years or so as leadership changed and commitments shifted. So this new investor focus, I think, is very constructive and helping to refocus the issue, but it does have a perverse outcome. Because of the focus on reporting, on disclosure and accountability, I'm seeing, and my colleagues as well, we're seeing an increasing number of companies that are jumping on the bandwagon around ESG, but all they're thinking about is, how do I collect the data? How do I report out? How do I show that I'm doing this, that I'm addressing ESG? And the focus is not on the doing, it's on the showing, which we know to be problematic. So what is it that we need to show, and across such a diverse range of issues, such as what the social issues covered in ESG? But it's important to ground that term in the fundamentals, and I'm just going to turn to that in a minute. I want to call attention to one particular issue that I think really needs to be taken seriously, and that is the tendency to see social to be about relationship issues, to be about the process of engagement, to be all about my relationship with my customers, communities, and suppliers. And there's a quote here, and I'll be very direct. It's not cited because I disagree with it, but it was at a fairly respectable website, saying that there are many separate social aspects of ESG, but all of them are essentially about social relationships. And the key point about my talk is that it's not about social relationships. It's about managing social impacts and social benefits, which in fact is what gives you good or bad social relationships. So the fundamentals need to be addressed, which is managing the risks and managing the issues. So what we see today, certainly in much of the online discussion, not necessarily what the serious companies are doing, is we see this focus on the upside. This is the relationship side. This is where we get to give positive benefits to different actors, community benefits, to attract and retain the best employees, societal contributions, and including among this, of course, is an increasing focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, on gender equity. All of these things are extremely positive, but these tend to be framed as contributions, as the upside that companies are contributing to. And the whole concept of social responsibility tends to focus on this issue of societal contributions and community benefits. And this is really where companies are seeing or articulating the social in ESG. But the critical issue and the basis on which strong relationships are built and effective management is integrated into the company is not in how you distribute benefits. It's managing the fundamentals. And as we will see with the increasing focus on human rights, as Tobias mentioned, the EU is moving toward hard law around requiring human rights due diligence. What that has helped us do is to keep the focus on not just the risk to the business, which we often see managing ESG as managing the risk to the business, which it is necessarily. But the human rights focus fundamentally says managing risks to people and to the environment and to people through environmental impacts. And it's also pushed a focus on, rather than the traditional practice, which is going ahead with developments and minimizing the negative impacts that come out of it through a series of measures. That's kind of the environmental regulatory model, is really saying negative impacts in particular to rights, need to be avoided. And so it's applying what we call the mitigation hierarchy. And you move first to avoid these impacts rather than mitigating them. And if you cannot mitigate them, then there's a decision whether you need to move ahead. And then there's mitigation and the actions that come from that. So this whole foundational piece, which is the basis on which good relationships are built with these different stakeholders, this is often very invisible in at least the online discussions and much of the way that ESG is articulated and framed today, and is fundamental. So, not to belabor this issue, but social, like environmental, is rooted in a series of very strong international standards that have been expanding and added to over the last couple of decades, starting with the IFC performance standards, which grew out of an earlier World Bank's social and environmental safeguard policies. So in terms of on the ground effects, this trajectory is fairly long and has led up to where we are today, and increasingly strengthened by the integration of human rights due diligence, by the endorsement of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which keeps the focus, as I said, on avoiding doing harm and respecting rights. So how do we do this? We do this, and we increasingly move into a sphere where the management of social issues is not a mystical, subjective, unmeasurable quagmire, but is in fact science and science-based and fact-driven, and there's the increasingly professionalized field of social performance, which as a group, the Social Practice Forum is committed to advancing. with the application of a social performance approach, you develop and you ensure that you have the expertise needed to address the critical issues. And social performance brings the optic of having measurable outcomes and a focus on impacts, and so we're moving away from what has traditionally been the easy piece, which is to show that we're doing something being better than nothing, moving toward what is measurable outcomes and what's the real impact. And this is where social impact measurement and the use of effective indicators are all very important. And on the basis of these measurable outcomes and impacts, then we report out, then we say what we're doing, then we show the wider world what we're doing. The social performance approach is also increasingly able to support well-defined ESG criteria. And there's some really important work, which Sarah has alluded to, and hopefully will be present in the conference, of moving toward a stronger and better definition of, in particular, the social criteria that need to be managed, and aligning that across the different organizations that are currently working to measure and report on criteria. But the social performance practice, the social performance optic, is also critical for the set of skills and expertise that it brings to actually reach out and effectively measure and understand the relationships with key stakeholder groups, all of which are important. And these need to be not just a focus of influencing the relationship, but of feeding into and informing the management of social performance, the management of social issues, and even the identification of what are the key risks, what are the key human rights vulnerabilities of the populations that may be affected by a project. So I know it's a very short period of time. Embedding social performance, clarifying the scope of what needs to be addressed by social performance, and moving it increasingly into a science-based, ensuring that you have the technical expertise that you need. You'll all be able to go back and read these bullets after the fact. But social performance is an increasingly mature and developed area of expertise. And there are many, many aspects of social management that are pretty well codified and understood. The Social Practice Forum is in the process of developing a series of papers which will soon become public, to provide guidance to social performance practitioners and to those who want to understand to develop a department of social performance in your company. And it will help, we believe, to consolidate the practice, but also to show the extent to which it needs to be an integrated part of companies for effectively delivering on the ESG commitments. So this is a link to the Social Practice Forum, and will allow you access to these papers, which should be out in the next couple of weeks. Thanks.
Brilliant. That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Susan. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together from the other side of those muted microphones for the fabulous Susan Joyce. Now, Susan, we've got a couple of questions that have been coming in. I've got a whole list of questions here, but again, we are constrained by time, unfortunately. So John Clark asks, he says, okay, so there's some fantastic guidance that's coming out at the moment, be it globally, internationally, or be it by region, such as British Columbia. Do we think that the guidance documents themselves and the publication of them actually shows us that there is significant progress, or what else is needed to really accelerate that process with regards to getting social performance to mean something?
I think the most important issue is the integration of social performance into the operational side of business. What we see are so many situations in which it's ghettoized, it's in a silo, it's not an integrated part. Less so than in the past, but it's still not fully understood the extent to which the information being collected by trained professionals in the field about risks and impacts, about vulnerabilities, about exposure to hazard. These need to be integrated into decision-making from early on. And so many opportunities are missed to do this. And, for example, the global industry standard on tailings management, which I'm following quite closely. It is written for a deeply integrated approach between the collection of this baseline information and decision-making at the company level from the earliest point on. Now, it's not necessarily rolling out that way yet. It has to mature. But this is the aspirational side of looking for this deeply integrated function of social performance that is influencing decision-making and is influenced by, it also understands the industry intimately, the business intimately, and the sites intimately, and the kind of decisions that have to be made. So it's got to be a two-directional or multi-directional flow as well. But that integration, I think, is critical, more so than even the guidance.
Susan, I think it's almost as if you've read John's next question, which is all about the global tailings guidance that's out there. But I won't ask you that question because I know you can answer it offline. One final question, though, before we pass to our next lovely speaker, and this is from Paul. And he says, do you think that this approach is still constrained by do less harm rather than actually looking for opportunity? Or where do you think this is in terms of working with communities, etc.? Is it about looking for opportunities, or is it more about doing less harm?
I think it's a mixed bag. I think that there has been a lot that has there's been a lot that's pushed toward looking at benefits, but it is, to be honest, in the mining sector, it's too often about dropping financial boons on communities, on regions, because you want to catch the next commodity cycle. You don't want to be delayed by social conflict. And this focus on, it's going to be so good, without truly seeding that in an analysis of what are the challenges and limitations to sustainable development in that area, and how that has to be scaled up and built in and developed over a period of time. So I think both with the focus on human rights, which gets a much solider attention to avoiding the negative impacts, and the long-term perspective for sustainable development that is beginning to be talked about. I think these two things will balance out that tension a bit more, but it's still a tension.
Brilliant. Well, I guess so long as I acknowledge it as being a tension rather than trying to ignore it, that's a good start, isn't it? So brilliant. Thank you so much, Susan. There are so many more questions that we could ask you now, but that was a fabulous introduction in a way to what do we mean by the social side of this compared to the more environmental side. So thank you very much, Susan. Round of applause for your lovely self. Brilliant.
Happy to respond to questions.
Yes, no, go
offline.
for it. So ladies and gentlemen, if you've got more questions for Susan, please do pop them into the Q&A, the chat, or via any of the other forums. We will get them to Susan so she can answer them for you. So we've had the E, we've just had the S. What about the G? What on earth do we mean by governance? And sometimes this is seen, I think everybody says that their one is the most complicated. But Ludovine, we're now going to pass across to your wonderful self to give us a little bit of insight as to what do we actually mean by the G, or the governance within ESG. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much to Sarah and to Rose for organizing this meeting. And frankly, thanks to Susan for pretty much setting up my entire talk. I think for those of you who know me, I'm firmly of the view that governance is in fact one of the fundamental tools for the integration of stakeholder interests and sustainability concerns more widely. And I mean, I'm just really happy to hear that there is so much forward-looking work that's going into the shaping of the S parameters, because I think governance primarily serves to allow those, as well as the environmental factors, to really become part of a holistic view of an exploration and mining company's performance. So let me start by a little bit of policy talk, because I like that, and then we'll get a little bit of a reality check and see how that actually works in real life. Very clearly, the integration of stakeholder interest and sustainability concerns has been happening at many levels. And I think in terms of policy, at least, we are moving, or perhaps have already moved past the false cost to value dilemma. And I think we're seeing that across legal frameworks applicable to exploration and mining in the countries where they take place, in industry standards, many of them have already been mentioned by previous speakers, in the regional, national, and market standards that apply to downstream buyers and users of the product, and also in corporate governance and investor stewardship codes. And I just want to raise a little bit of a flag around corporate governance codes themselves. The most recognized corporate governance frameworks have defined a link between governance, and in particular directors' duties, and sustainability and stakeholders for a long time. I mean, we can cite the UK Companies Act, which dates to 2006, for example. But there's now a lot of calls for a shift from an obligation for directors to consider sustainability and stakeholders to much stronger, much more stringent requirements to actually balance stakeholder interest in corporate decision-making. So it sounds like a technicality, but this could really, if it comes to pass, shift completely how companies position, take risks, how boards manage these issues. And it's currently a big debate, particularly around shifting from principles-based frameworks, particularly with a lot of comply or explain voluntary codes coupled with mandatory disclosure requirements, towards a much more regulated approach. And of course, there's pros and cons to all. So I would encourage you to watch this space to see how these things are evolving. So now on to the reality check. What does this mean in terms of implementation? And again, I always choose to focus not on governance for its own sake, but rather in terms of how it can help companies to improve their environmental and social performance, along with every other type of performance, including operational and financial. And in that regard, before having this talk with you today, I spoke with a series of practitioners in environmental impact assessment, in environmental permitting and auditing, mine closure, community and stakeholder engagement. And all of them, first of all, are inspirational in their vision for mining and minerals. So I want to thank them for their time. But also, they raised some really consistent themes for action within mining. And we drew some pretty simple recommendations as to how governance practices can best support progress on those themes and map those back fairly directly to governance principles of accountability and empowerment and transparency and fairness. So the first theme that comes up all the time when I discuss with my colleagues about how governance can support their work is commitments and obligations. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before because it's very much part of my experience as well. But I mean, let's consider that for an industry that's entirely dependent on access, operating, and commercialization rights, we seem to have enduring gaps in our management of the relating obligations and commitments. And if we bring all of that under a wide view of permitting, I think part of the issue is that it crosses the boundaries between regulatory, government relations, community engagement, operational risk. And of course, we think first and foremost of mineral title, but the fact is permitting now encompasses hundreds, if not thousands, of approvals and commitments across a variety of instruments, and which touch on environmental constraints, social requirements, business operations. And these not only are binding on operators, but they also come full circle when non-compliance can affect mineral title through cross-default provisions. And that's before we even go into the dramatic situations where social license to operate weaknesses pretty much nullify mineral title because you can't actually do what your license allows you to do. So considering how essential this is to our business, what do we see in practice? We see not always a great track record, to be honest. We see binding plans and policies that are often prepared by great consultants and then instantly shelved. Sometimes they're misunderstood, sometimes they're completely ignored by operating teams who are not trained to leverage their local knowledge by mapping it back to these strategic tools. We also see very frequently incomplete, poorly monitored compliance and permitting registers, which, if they exist, are sometimes disseminated among various functions at site level. This, of course, in turn affects the quality and efficiency of management systems, which are mandated for environmental and social performance. And you realize that very often there's someone who knew but couldn't action that knowledge or get it to the right level of people, which indicates that decision-making is either ill-informed or inconsistent with corporate values and principles. And all of that really is allowed to pass because of a lack of oversight, both internal and external, in that regulatory authorities in many markets, particularly emerging markets, are sometimes not, correctly equipped to actually challenge operators on these issues, which together combine to allow commitments to be ignored or unduly delayed. So there's a million examples, particularly in the community relations sphere. And quite frankly, it seems that the timing of most, risk of non-compliance seems to be around the construction phase. For some reason, we get so hung up on delivering that a lot of ancillary issues suddenly become very, very secondary until, of course, they come right back to front and center. So I would say that the first collective recommendations that we formulated with my colleagues, and coming back to the governance angle, was really for the management of exploration and management and mining companies to define effective monitoring, coordination, and responsibilities for reporting, which go right to the top of the company without necessarily filtering environmental or social concerns through operational management. The second, more practical recommendation is to invest heavily in the environmental and social management system, and to use that system to ensure, first of all, that high quality data is provided to the board in particular, but also that this information turns into action and that this action is monitored. So these systems are really geared to create a circular flow of information, and they should be a key part of achieving environmental and social performance. And frankly, they are typically governance tools. And the last recommendation is to work to bring top-level commitment, which is often expressed in policies and corporate statements, to middle and functional management levels, whether that's through stronger personal buy-in, incentivization, or redefinition of responsibilities. There's a second theme, which kind of relates to the first, and which Susan already alluded to earlier, and that is the issue of silos and isolation. And of course, it's not a new issue, but it's particularly pressing in a context of integration, which by definition requires that sustainability and stakeholder concerns be pulled out of a neat little box and permeate all levels of decision-making so that they can become visible both in actions and outcomes by companies. So I see the silo issue actually play out in 3 different ways. The first and obvious one is the nearsighted view that, you know, E&S are allocated to a specific function or department or team, and that everybody else in the business can just carry on without worrying about it. The second aspect of the silo issue is quite interesting, because I hadn't realized it was such an issue before speaking about it to my colleagues in environmental and social, which is the fact that you've got an increasing level of governance parameters integrated into environmental and social standards. So actually, technicians in environmental and social performance are sometimes taken aback by this new aspect of their, you know, their own expertise. So we need to overcome that as well. And finally, the third sort of you know, materialization of the silo issue, and perhaps the most pernicious, is the ongoing gap between corporate HQ and site or country offices. And it really disproportionately affects management of environmental, social, and governance matters. So I realize what I'm talking about here is a big culture change. In order to get there, I think there's a few, again, practical recommendations we can consider. The first one sounds fluffy, but is actually real in terms of its implementation, which is for management to embrace the notion that all management is change management in mining these days. So very often we see executives across all functions, not just environmental and social, who want to change habits, who want to allow more interdisciplinary decision-making, and they're not allowed to, or they're not incentivized to. So we need to make that shift to allow these outcomes to happen. The second practical recommendation is to lead by example. Senior executives need to be actively present in community engagement, in government relations, in public initiatives in country. And when I say actively, that means actually take action on the findings and outcomes of those initiatives. And a third recommendation is training. And in that regard, I just want to stress, businesses have a tendency to encourage and reward training that's primarily matching an employee's function or profession. What we're seeing here is a need for cross-functional training. So, you know, governance training for a team of geologists is actually a great step forward. Community engagement training for technical professionals, particularly across cultural and language barriers. Environmental and social impact training for governance consultants. All of these are ways for us to break out of our silos and understand each other's constraints better. And the last recommendation I will mention is really to try to turn one-way relationships into multilateral communication channels. And in this regard, I was really struck by the conclusion of one of my discussions about grievances. So we basically usually view the grievance mechanism as a huge headache and a risk, as in a threat. Whereas actually, if you open it up to become a healthy flow of information, not only can it be an early warning system, but it actually serves to continually create an exchange forum with a lot of affected stakeholders. So all of these are practical tools which I've experienced or implemented with my colleagues in environmental and social. There's also, as I said, a lot of debate about this. If you're interested, I recommend you look at the International Corporate Governance Network Governance of Sustainability Dialogue, which is happening in June. And do you have any questions? Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ludovine. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together from the other side of your muted mics for the lovely Ludovine. Ludovine, I'm sure that we can post a link to that event that you just cited there and gave a shout out to, because I'm sure that lots of people will be interested in that. Time for just a couple of very quick questions. So one of which is, we see sometimes in perhaps national governance or regulation, people saying, okay, we understand the environment, we understand the social bits, but actually we really struggle to get governance into those sort of regulatory requirements. Do you have any insight as to that or any solutions for us?
Well, I mean, I'm pretty much talking myself out of a job here, but I'd say the first step is to demystify. Governance is not a mysterious world of complicated words by lawyers and compliance officers. Governance is about effectively managing accountability and empowering people to be able to do their jobs in the best way possible to achieve the best outcomes possible. So when I hear about, groups struggling to integrate the governance angle into a thought process about ESG, frankly, my first recommendation is, well, start by not thinking about it. Map out what it is you're looking to achieve, because trust me, once you've mapped out those routes, you'll realize that half of that is governance, because governance is about having sound policies and processes, but also making sure that there's a culture to back those up where they remain more than, quite frankly, paper stuck in corporate HQs.
So is that something there where actually with governance, exactly as you said, that's where the accountability, but also the culture really comes from, through which you take environment and social seriously? Is that correct?
I think it's entirely correct, but I think it's also where debates are starting to happen as to how that happens. So to date, you have, as I said, a lot of corporate governance frameworks which focus on ultimately all the way up to the board, but they create a general obligation for a company and its board to consider stakeholders, to look at long-term implications. There's now a lot of discussion about, should we regulate that? Should we make this a more mandatory system? Should we say, well, you can't decide in favor of the company, you need to always balance different stakeholder interests. So there's a lot of talk about the mechanics of implementing accountability. But before you get to all that, I mean, we all know how to say, okay, well, I committed to this, I'm going to do it this way, and I want positive outcomes to be that. So I think once we step back to the reality of what we're doing on the ground, a lot of the complexity falls into place. Not that I have a problem with complexity, but a lot of governance comes down to just doing our jobs well and considering others, in my view.
Perfect. That's absolutely fantastic, Ludovine. Thank you so much. And just while we give Ludovine another round of applause, Ludovine, there are some questions for you in the Q&A. So if you wouldn't mind going and taking a look at those, that would be fabulous. So ladies and gents, we are whistling along through this agenda here today because it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker of the day. So we've heard from the WWF in terms of the environment side. We heard from Susan in terms of social, and Ludovine with regards to governance. But what does this look like when you have to bring it all together? And we heard just now lots from Ludovine in terms of, okay, senior leaders, the discussions and decisions as well, and how do you create that organizational culture? Elaine Dorward-King is someone who has had all of that on her shoulders and still does at the moment. So Elaine, if I can invite you to come off mute and to join us for your talk, and if you'd like to give a proper introduction to yourself as well, that would be fabulous. So ladies and gents, put your hands together for a round of applause for Elaine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I was feeling slightly sorry for myself, but Susan got up even earlier than I did this morning to give an absolutely brilliant talk. So I have no excuses. So I've spent about almost 30 years in the mining industry in a number of first technical roles and then leadership roles. Finally, with Newmont Mining Corporation as Executive Vice President for Sustainability and External Relations. And now I've got the privilege to serve on several boards of directors for 3 mining companies and 1 non-mining company. And the timing turned out to be pretty good because everybody's really interested in ESG these days after all these decades. So it's a brilliant thing. And I'm having a good time doing that. What I have put together really has two components. And the first is to talk about the risk and performance aspects of strategy and implementation, and what I think and have seen to work well for companies. And it has a lot of the elements and a lot of the pieces that we've already heard about this morning from Susan and Ludovine in particular. And then I want to talk about culture and how you can think about culture and how important that is, in addition to putting in place the hierarchy of really policy strategies and systems that you need to have. So to start with, the way I think about the hierarchy is you start with the policies that the board of directors sets for a company that really are commitments or promises for what the board is committing to for all shareholders and stakeholders. It's then management's responsibility to put in place for the company the strategies, the standards, the procedures and practices that will deliver those policies for the stakeholders. Strategies are important because they address those longer term risks that companies need to face, such as water management, such as biodiversity, such as the things that are not immediately addressed just by putting performance standards in place, that both from a impact on the ground and from a protection of the company point of view require deeper thinking and longer term objectives and goals. But you also need to put in place standards that are very clear about what are the expectations for operations in terms of performance across the social and the environmental space. And in the context of the way most mining companies are thinking about the social piece, that does include the safety piece, safety and health of employees, as well as reaching out into communities. It's then important that you have the right kinds of management systems in place for the organization, ones that are fit for purpose, that enable the collection of data, the collection of information that's important, and the ability for that information to be used then for decision making by the leaders that need access to that data. And that's, sounds like a fairly easy thing to do. It's not easy. It's hard to get people to pay attention to it, to spend money on it. But once you have that in place, it gives the organization the power to actually know if they're doing the things that they want to do or think that they want to do. The next level of the hierarchy then is setting the right indicators and metrics so that you are measuring the things that are important, that you know what your performance is when you begin your journey and how you're advancing toward that. And also so you can demonstrate that to the stakeholders that are interested in it. And that then leads to an element that I think I'm a real proponent of, which is companies setting targets for what they want to achieve, whether that's on the environmental side or the social side. I think it's very valuable to set internal targets when you're starting to work on things, but I think it's extremely valuable to be willing to set public targets in selected areas so that the stakeholders that care about what you're doing can actually follow whether you're delivering on your commitment. And targets really do help drive performance, I believe. They're a communication tool and they help drive actual performance on the ground. And then finally, there's the reporting. There's disclosure and reporting on how you are doing. How are you meeting your commitments? How are you going or traveling toward those targets, whether they're annual short-term targets or 3-year, 5-year, or in the case of energy and climate change targets, decadal targets for how you're going to have an impact and change things. One of the things that is important, and I think it was alluded to in the previous talks, is the importance of setting targets that are outcome-based targets. I don't really care how many meetings people go to, what kind of activities they do. I don't actually even care how much money you spend on different things. What I do care about is, are you having an impact? Are you creating, a better life for the communities and the people that are around where a mining project may be? Are you actually eliminating or minimizing environmental impact? What are those actual outcomes? And that's really difficult. And I think that also, that's where you want to be. If you're early in the journey, and some companies are early in the journey, it's okay then to have process-oriented targets, to have things that help you move on your journey. But your ultimate goal is to be able to talk about, not how many schools did you build, how many children advanced into secondary or tertiary education, and how many girls stayed in school as before, and things like that are actually measurable. Let's see. I may come back to some of those points, but I want to talk about culture because it's so very important. And culture, the ability for you to achieve these things, to have good ESG performance, means that you must have commitment and buy-in all the way through the organization. From the board of directors supporting the CEO, to the CEO having an executive leadership team that understands the importance, and being able to cascade that down into the operations so that achieving social and environmental performance is not the job of the poor safety guy over here or the environmental manager over here. It's everybody's job and everybody's understanding of what their role there is. And part of the way you achieve that is being very, very clear about where you're going and what accountabilities are. But the way you really embed that is for the company to be aligned around what the purpose of the company is, and for that to be aligned to the values that are consistent with strong ESG performance. And that's something that companies talk a lot about nowadays, more than we probably used to, is purpose is more than just making money. It's more than the company simply being profitable. People want to come to work and be proud about what they're achieving with the majority of their life, which is spent working. And so it's helpful to define the purpose of the company in that bigger realm of what you are trying to achieve. And some examples of that at Newmont when I was there, and for most of the period of the 7 years I was there, and still their purpose is the same. It was to create value and improve lives through responsible mining. And that was a purpose statement that we talked a lot about putting in place, because was it our purpose to improve lives? Well, yeah, we decided it actually was. And we talked about the purpose a lot. It wasn't just something that was up on a wall or in the ESG, buried on the internet in an ESG report. We talked about it, and everyone knew, our employees knew that was the purpose of the company. And that was aligned with a list of 5 values: safety, sustainability, inclusion, integrity, and responsibility. And those are pretty fundamental things, and lots of companies have values. But if you talk about those values all the time, they become things you don't think about. They're here. They're how you think about the way that you do business. And that's important, because when a difficult situation arises, you want all the people in your organization to know what the right thing is to do, and not to have to think about it, and not to have to be told. And if that's in place in the organization from the CEO on down, the likelihood of making a catastrophic mistake is lessened. It's not eliminated. People do make mistakes, but it's lessened. And there are other examples of companies that are very articulate about their purpose, and everyone in the company knows it. And that then creates a culture where it's easier to have priority and give priority to your social and environmental agenda, because often that's very aligned to what the values of the company are. You know, and everybody knows that safety comes before production, protecting the environment comes before production, looking after our community's interest and their rights comes before production. You're more likely to make the right decisions most of the time. And I want to just quickly touch on the one thing, and that is the resourcing piece. You know, that companies need to have people in their organization that can provide leaders with the right advice and that are listened to. I don't think it's adequate to depend on consultants for all of your intellectual capacity in this area. But I also think it's completely achievable for companies of all sizes to achieve strong social and environmental performance. You focus on the things that are material to you. If you're a very small company, that's going to be a small basket of things that are truly important for you to measure, monitor, and drive performance on. If you're a bigger company, it's going to be a bigger basket and you resource that appropriately. But it's not just the big players in the industries that can achieve a strong social and environmental ethic and performance. I believe everybody can do it. And the data are increasingly strong that if you do excel and have those commitments in place and deliver on that, you're going to deliver stronger financial results and deliver, you know, more value to all of your stakeholders, including your shareholders, over time. So I am going to stop, Sarah. Hopefully we left a few minutes for some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Elaine. Ladies and gents, please put your hands together. So massive thank you for the fabulous Elaine. So with that, Elaine, that's really good clapping there, Paul. Thank you for that. It's great. So with that, Elaine, you finished off there with actually by getting this right, or even just a little bit right, we see the tangible success really coming through on the financial side. It's not just the right thing to do. Actually, that reward tends to come through as well. Do you see ESG and sustainability, if we come onto the strategic side of things, actually there being a massive opportunity for the mining sector here in the long term by getting this right, rather than just perhaps trying to reduce the potential negative impacts that the mining industry might have on things like the environment? So, I mean, can you provide any examples where you see that tangible upside on the financial side by getting the ESG correct, if that makes sense?
Well, I think you could, there are so many levels where it's an opportunity more than a threat. You know, risk is threat and opportunity. And on the opportunity side, if you're thinking long-term and you're really looking at the things that are strategically important to your business, you are going to be putting in place the things that you need to harden your business against the impacts of climate change, for example, to have the resilience to respond if there is a disaster, to adapt as things go, to help your local communities adapt. So if you are thinking about and using the information that says, okay, what is going to happen, what's going to change in my physical environment over the next decade or two, and how do I need to respond, you know, to create a resilient, adaptive company that can help you protect your supply chain. Because when you look in the mining industry at what the biggest vulnerabilities are, it's usually not facilities and local infrastructure, it's the supply chain. Can you get your inputs in that you need, and can you get your products out? And so what are you doing to harden your supply chain? The other real opportunity for mining companies, and this is, you know, being talked about all the time, is are you thinking long term about what commodities you actually want to be mining? You know, what are the things that are going to be important as we transition to a low carbon future? You know, the copper is obvious, but there's a whole list of other things that are strategically important. And where are they located? Are you seeking to operate in jurisdictions where the geopolitical risk is manageable and where you can create partnerships that will allow you to be successful in the long run? So, you know, even from a fundamentals of what materials and products are you going to focus your business on for the next 20, 30, 40 years, you know, and you're seeing companies already making investments, starting to make shifts, you know, getting rid of assets that perhaps aren't aligned to that vision of the future of where they want to see themselves positioned, and not just in the mining sector, but in other sectors as well.
So I guess what I'm hearing there, and Susan made the point very clearly as well, of almost like the earlier in terms of that mining value chain that you think about all of this, or at least incorporate ESG into what is it that you want to do, what's your purpose, what's your strategy, then you're setting yourself up for success in the long run, rather than doing it almost retrospectively with, okay, I've now got a mine here, how do we make the best of this? Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. I would be, hopefully every mine that we build from zero, that we build from scratch these days, is going to have a small footprint. It's going to be essentially zero discharge. We're going to manage our waste in a way that's intelligent. We're going to minimize the amount of waste we generate. We're going to minimize the inputs that we use in terms of water and energy and other things. We're going to, mines are already very technological, and we try to automate where we can, from a safety point of view as well as a cost point of view. But being smart about our use of technology as well. Those are all opportunities that you embed into your business strategy, and that helps you be successful then in the long run.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Elaine, and especially that list almost of, okay, what should these mines going into the future actually look like? And actually a competition that we are launching today at the end is, last year we asked everybody to submit drawings, be them done by yourselves or by children or various relations of what do you think a mine looks like. This year, we're asking a similar question with a key difference. What do you think a responsible mine looks like? It might look exactly the same, or actually that mine of the future or that responsible mine may look very, very different. And I think what we've just heard there from Elaine are some of those ideas that would hopefully be incorporated with that. So Elaine, again, there are lots of questions coming in for you on the Q&A. I've only been able to ask you a couple of them, but ladies and gents, a massive round of applause for the fantastic Elaine. Thank you very, very much. Brilliant. So next, ladies and gentlemen, you heard both, well, in fact, everybody so far today has alluded to this vast array of guidance and governance that sits outside of those mining companies. So this is where international standards, etc., come to play. And as Elaine was mentioning earlier on, a lot of the measurements or the targets that we hold ourselves to, be it us working within mining or perhaps people working from outside of the mining sector as well. Where does all of this steering actually come from? And that's one of the aspects that our next fantastic speaker, so Emma Beattie, is going to be looking at. Now, Emma, I don't know if you have a PowerPoint that you would like to share. Now is a good time to start sharing that screen. But ladies and gentlemen, yes, we've got yet another female speaker for you this afternoon. Don't worry, the boys are going to be coming next. This is going to be a very gender balanced conference as we go through all of this, but please put your hands together for the fantastic Emma Beattie. And Emma, I will invite you to introduce yourself as well. So thank you very much, Emma.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks very much, Rose, for organising this and inviting me today. Just whilst my computer figures out how it's going to share this. I'm Emma Beattie. I'm the Director of Research at MineHut, where we focus on sort of legal risk analysis and mining codes and regulations and sort of the associated consultancy services with that. So at the heart of what we do is sort of analysing the mining laws and the environmental laws that people are going to have to comply with when they're in a jurisdiction, and providing sort of risk advice on the basis of those laws. And I think just to sort of start out where we kind of came up with the idea for what I'm going to talk about today, I think it's sort of fairly widely accepted that mining companies traditionally haven't really been that great at telling people about their role in the global economy or of the good things that they do in relation to their projects. So I'm not sure it came as any surprise to me, at least, when one of my colleagues who was working in the ESG space a lot more than I was at the time sort of mentioned that companies are having challenges in terms of how they're reporting what they're doing in terms of ESG, and how they're communicating the things that they do. But what did surprise me when we sort of started exploring it a little bit more and talking about it a little bit more, is, as someone who's been sort of reading mining laws and regulations for sort of 6 or 7 years, is how many of those standards were, to my mind, already applicable to people. And I sort of said, to my colleague, well, why don't they go and talk to their legal department? Because surely they've had to do a load of this stuff to get their license in the first place. And where we went from there was that, yes, there are lots of these standards around, and though they're not, necessarily disagreeable as standards, what do they kind of mean in practice? And are they already part of the legal framework that's sort of applicable to mining projects in lots of jurisdictions? So effectively, you can be meeting certain aspects of ESG compliance or complying with certain ESG standards essentially through your legal compliance. So you've gone through a process to meet sort of certain requirements that can then feed into your ESG reporting, and be part of that sort of ESG story that you're telling, because it's coming from those sort of legal frameworks that your project is regulated by. And just a few points here before I kind of go on to look at some examples. I'm not considering today, or not necessarily planning to consider today, whether or not it's up to governments to have legislation which fixes ESG requirements. Though I think that with the number of standards that are out there at the moment, it may well be useful for companies to see more of these kind of translated into law. And I also believe that sort of governments and their legal requirements, probably for very practical reasons, haven't necessarily been the sort of focus of ESG standards, mainly because it's easier to kind of set voluntary standards than it is to write a law or to get people to change their laws to adapt those those different aspects. And I also think it's worth noting sort of from the outset, the degree of what I'll call ESG provisions in mining law varies a lot from country to country. And what I will say on this point is that we tend to see a higher number of ESG provisions in mining laws in countries which require greater sort of contributions socially and economically from their mining sector. You'll see a lot more of the standards actually be legal standards rather than voluntary standards. And you might also see a higher volume of those standards in countries where the sort of main laws and regulations in the jurisdiction aren't as strong. So where you've got perhaps slightly weaker kind of labour and employment laws or kind of weaker human rights laws. You'll see certainly where there's been sort of international input into the mining code that's come out of it, you'll see the mining code as a much more comprehensive sort of standalone piece of legislation that relies less on sort of pulling in other laws, which we might see in more developed countries. So let's go on to look at a sort of few examples of this. I won't sort of read through these slides, and I don't necessarily think that anyone else should either, but they're just an example of how those standards are kind of translating into the provisions of the law. So I've started out with a country that I would say has fairly small levels of sort of ESG provisions, generally speaking, in their mining law, but has reacted more to sort of growing concerns in country and in the international community. So if we take a look at Brazil, I think we are starting to sort of see here that the Brazilian government has now started to kind of use the mechanism of the law to regulate things that we would now sort of class as ESG. And what I'm doing here is kind of drawing against that sort of ICMM standard as my sort of guidance for some of those ESG principles, and how that's kind of translating into the legislation. So you'll see in Brazil that if you're kind of meeting the standards in the law around tailings dams and the new sort of legal obligations that have now come around since sort of 2017 in the country, that they are now sort of meeting those environmental performance standards of the ICMM much more effectively than you might have seen in the past in Brazil, and in terms of what requirements were put on mining companies in terms of their tailings dams. So you would be sort of compliant with that particular standard of the ICMM at this point now, if you were to comply with Brazilian legislation and make sure that that was implemented effectively. And sort of turning next, I think it's pretty sort of safe to say, and I think a lot of people won't be surprised to learn that the E of ESG is much more likely to translate into legislation than certainly the S. So it's much more common to kind of see those environmental aspects of ESG addressed through the law. A lot of countries have sort of developed quite strong EIA processes and codes now, sort of in the last 5 or 10 years, though they may have issues with sort of the implementation and management of them. If you're just looking at the legal obligations that apply in the EIA space, it tends to be quite strong, and we see that here with Finland. So there's a comprehensive kind of EIA process. It involves mandatory public consultation. It involves lots of publicly available materials, and it's, you know, a key aspect of the licensing decision. So you're not going to progress with that license until this ESIA approval is obtained. But I think what's more of a surprise when we look at somewhere like Finland is we're moving kind of out of the E to the sort of S of ESG. And you're also seeing the law that addresses things like human rights. So specifically in the mining code and regulations, we're finding that ESG provisions are starting to appear. And in Finland, that's specific to sort of Indigenous people. So if we look at the ICMM standards under Principle 3 in terms of, you know, respect to Indigenous people and free, prior and informed consent, the way that Finland has actually structured its law means that if you have obtained your mining license, particularly in these areas, you will have gone through an incredibly rigorous process of consultations, of consent, and if at any point there is a sort of refusal or pushback, or there is a lack of consent from the community, those people will be afforded preference under the law. So it will be their say that is final. So if they reject the project, then the project will not proceed. So we're seeing not just the sort of E of ESG being addressed through the law, we're also seeing that S addressed through the law as well. And so for the sort of next country that I'm going to look at, I thought it would be useful to take a look at a country where, first of all, I think people might be quite surprised to learn that there are relatively high sort of ESG standards, or perhaps the opposite way of saying it is true, is that they would think that maybe your ESG wouldn't be as high. But B, where in fact a country where the legal framework contains some of the highest sort of levels of ESG provisions I've ever seen in the sort of 120, 130 mining codes that I've read. So in the case of Malawi, social and environmental standards are incredibly stringent under the law. You'll have to meet a whole number of them just in order to kind of progress to your licensing. And I think Ludovine sort of touched upon earlier the sort of, it's part of that permitting process. Well, certainly in Malawi, you're going to find that you are addressing a whole number of ESG considerations in your ability to obtain a mining license. I've touched upon the sort of human rights aspects there that apply at both the kind of exploration stage and moving on to the mining stage, and also those ESIA structures that we talked about earlier, but also in terms of your social performance. So all the kind of requirements that the ICMM are setting out as ESG standards under Principle 9, social performance. If you sort of follow certainly the letter of the law in Malawi, you're going to find that you're meeting those standards quite well. And I think though you are absolutely undoubtedly going to grapple with the sort of challenges that people have raised here in terms of monitoring and managing your obligations and your commitments in Malawi, because you will have a whole lot of them by the end of this licensing process. If you're following the letter of the law, really regardless of whether or not the government itself has the capacity to monitor it, which I think is certainly going to be a question in Malawi, you will be answering a whole host of kind of ESG concerns on the investor side purely by compliance with that law and the implementation of it. And And in theory, this is the only way in Malawi for you to maintain your license, is by meeting and continuing to meet these ESG requirements sort of throughout the course of your project, and implementing these plans and programs that you've sort of set out. So your social performance effectively is being dictated by your licensing obligations, and by those obligations that you've made at the point at which you've obtained a mining license. And in Malawi, which you don't often see, but you certainly see here, is that all the commitments and obligations that are set out under those plans and programs that you submit as part of your license application actually form conditions of your license. It's not enough to just sort of submit them and have them exist. You are bound by their terms, and they do form part of your license terms and conditions. So that's me. It's a very quick overview of kind of your legal obligations and how we're seeing those standards translate through into your ESG requirements.
Fantastic. That was absolutely brilliant. So round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for the fantastic Emma Beattie. That was brilliant. And don't worry, all of the slides, the recording, etc., will be available for you. So if you want to see some of that detail that Emma was flashing up on the screen in front of you later, you will be able to check it out. So Emma, just while we're waiting for more of the questions to land, and there are lots of questions coming in for you. So why Malawi? Why does Malawi have such stringent rules? What makes it so special?
It's a good question. The mining code being 200 pages long, I would say, is one of them. No, I think basically what we've seen in Malawi really is a culmination of a lot of the kind of activity where consultants have sort of played a role in drafting mining laws. So I think we've really reached the sort of ultimate consultants version of what a mining law should look like. Now, from a risk perspective, I'm not necessarily saying that tying these obligations to your ability to obtain your license is a very good thing, especially when they're kind of discretionarily assessed by the government in terms of are they satisfactory or not. But in terms of your ESG requirements and what you're being asked to sort of do with it, Malawi has really kind of set out its stall as using its mining code basically to draw as much benefit as it can out of industry. And I think part of that, I understand that there's been sort of consultants involved in that, but I think also part of it is that by making these legal obligations, Malawi, which is going to be very, very reliant on what is at the moment quite a junior mining industry, will sort of realize the benefits of that in the way that countries with perhaps older mining industries that haven't sort of had that structure around them have maybe done. And I think they've definitely used the mining law as that kind of catch-all. So to address all your other concerns, your labour and employment concerns, your health and safety concerns, your social responsibilities, they've really used the mining law as a sort of governing code for all aspects of your project, which you don't tend to see in countries, as I said earlier, where they tend to draw from kind of other laws and regulations that are applicable there. Malawi really is saying, the mining law is critical to your project.
And what do you think is better, or is it just context specific, if a country manages to pull it all together in a nice cohesive package like Malawi, or other countries where they're pulling together different strands of existing law? What tends to work better?
I don't necessarily think that we sort of have the answer to that yet. I think it kind of remains to be seen, because one of the problems with putting a law like this down in somewhere like Malawi is what I touched on earlier, is, what does the capacity look like to monitor? If one mining project has to submit 13 programs and plans, what's the capacity like to monitor how those plans are being implemented? Not just the challenges, as Ludovine spoke about, of sort of the companies being able to manage them, but what is the government's ability to be able to manage them? So whilst I think it makes it simpler to have it in that kind of package, I'm not 100% convinced that a mining law that's as long and kind of as onerous as the one that Malawi has in place will be effective unless it's implemented and monitored in the way that it's meant. And I think some focus has to be paid on the capacity that Malawi has to kind of implement the law it's been given. Otherwise, it's only really as useful as the sort of paper it's written on.
So actually very similar to what Elaine, for example, was saying, is you actually have to use it. You can't just write down that plan. You actually need to make it mean something and then monitor it as well to make sure it's actually being implemented.
Exactly, and I think the sort of the case in Malawi really needs to be that sort of collaborative relationship between the sort of company and the government. I don't think, you know, the answer certainly shouldn't be from the company side, not that I'm suggesting it would, but, you know, well, the government are never going to be able to monitor all this stuff, so why should we do it? I think you're going to have to build those sort of collaborative relationships and be working on building the government's capacity to monitor your obligations too.
So that's the case there. And I think you make a really good point. So this isn't just something where all the onus is on the mining companies. It's also on that capacity and capability and understanding of the likes of government. And in a few minutes, we are going to then go sideways into the world of finance, because we're going to pull in Paul Pritchard and ask him to say, OK, what are some of the changes that have been happening in the world of finance? But before we do that, Paul, so we're almost coming to you, sir. There are a couple more questions, Emma. So from Brad Wilson, he asks, how does, say, the World Bank or, say, mining insurance play a role in the legislative side of ESG? So, I mean, how does that drive things? And I know we're going to come on to that, but I'd be interested to hear your perspective. So how does finance and insurance drive some of the legislative side?
Well, I don't think that, I mean, finance in terms of the sort of funding from the World Bank to reform mining codes, I think has been quite critical to a lot of countries in terms of that kind of capacity and sort of getting laws in place that are suitable for the regulation of industry. I'm not yet sure that they've kind of found the ground between the sort of, you know, the companies that have to implement and abide by these laws, and, as I said before, the sort of consultant's dream of what that law should look like versus, I suppose, the alternative, which is the investor's dream of what that mining code should look like. So I'm not sure that the World Bank necessarily, the sort of world of finance and insurance, have yet made sort of considerable strides, at least in recognizing that they're implementing ESG provisions. I think there's certainly been an increasing requirement to see sort of social obligations included in mining laws and regulations. And I think a lot of the sort of drive behind that has certainly come from institutions like the World Bank, who, you know, sort of see the benefit in that being a legal obligation rather than a sort of voluntary standard. But I don't think there is yet a drive to sort of say, actually, if you want to set your ESG standards, we're going to use your mining code to do it. I don't think we're yet seeing that kind of translate through to mining laws in any or at least make sort of substantial differences to mining laws than what we've seen in the past. So I'm not sure we've yet seen that translate into legislation, although I would imagine that we will at some point.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emma. And one final question. So this is from John Clark, and he says, so you've mentioned many different types of management plans and assessments. Is there international guidance with regards to what constitutes a good management plan or EIA, etc., or is that something that is needed?
I definitely think it's something that's needed. I think it's needed not just from the sort of side of the people having to put them out there, but also to give mining companies sort of actual objective standards and programs together, because if you actually read the sort of Malawi's legislation through, you'll see that the only actual requirement for these plans and programs is that they are to the satisfaction of government, which is not a particularly content guidance that anybody can take and kind of make anything of. And I think that certainly it would be a lot more beneficial to companies to see at least minimum content requirements and things like that as form part of at least the decision-making process as to how we're going to deem something satisfactory or not. So no, there are not those standards, and there are not kind of international standards in what looks good. I think probably you'll see them more in the sort of, as I said, in the environmental space than anywhere else. But in terms of, you know, what makes for a good procurement program, what makes for a good community development agreement, I think no is the answer. And I think the world itself, or the mining industry, certainly would benefit from some sort of boundaries and frameworks being set in terms of that content.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emma. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the wonderful Emma Beattie. Brilliant. So we've gone through the E, the S, the G. We've then taken a look at this from the mining perspective through the eyes of Elaine. We've then gone, okay, let's talk about this more from the government's perspective and that legislative perspective through Emma. Now let's go into that world of finance, where there's been huge change over the last 12 months or so. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the fantastic Paul Pritchard, who's going to give us some insight to the wonderful world of TCFD, etc. Paul, over to yourself.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And I'm going to start off with a very quick reminisce, if you'll allow me, in that for many years, for someone who's worked in finance for a long time and been doing environment first, then sustainability, normally when I would do a presentation, I would start off with an admission, that, my name's Paul and I work in finance, and, expect the kind of low level boos and hisses and things like that. And there still are some people that think that I'm doing the work of the devil, not just me, collectively, but thankfully, it's changing massively. And just as you said, it's a reflection of a lot of the activity that's been going on. Well, really, yeah, like you're saying, the last 12, 24 months, a little bit longer, has been the real period of change and development within the sector. And one of the things that struck me just as you were, in fact, as we were going through the speakers today, I was actually rapidly making notes and changing it to reflect on things that people were saying. And for a long time saying, well, I'm sorry, we don't really do that. And there's nothing going on in the sector in regulation. And wouldn't it be great if we had some standards and governance around this? Actually, there are things in place and coming in place. So I think we're already seeing a lot of early signs. And if we take regulation, for instance, it's been a bugbear of mine for many years that the kind of overarching global regulatory framework for finance, the kind of post-war system, looked at risk and looked at financial risks to the system, didn't look at anything like climate or environment. It just looked like a huge gap in there. That's definitely changing. So we're seeing, for instance, the guidance that came out towards the end of last year from the European Central Bank, which provides guidance to the national regulators, telling them what they expect to see in terms of governance and management, specifically around climate and environmental risks at the moment. But I think the social risks will actually get in there. And in fact, looking at governance, when we were talking about that, I think it was really interesting, because one of the things that came to mind straight away is something called the senior managers regime in UK finance, whereby, fairly simple measure, large finance organizations have to have a named person who's responsible for climate issues, and it will be environment. And you won't see a lot about this in published sustainability reports, but I can absolutely tell you for sure, when you have that individual named as being the person responsible, they're going to make sure that they actually understand this and that the things that are reported don't reflect badly on them. So there's like small things like that are mandatory coming through the regulatory regime, may not seem a huge deal outside, and nobody's going to say, now we've got somebody, a named individual who's responsible for it. Of course we have, we've always taken this seriously, but actually little things like that, maybe not such a little thing, has quite a big effect. The other thing I was going to say, and it came right through from Tobias right at the start, is that a lot of the activity in this space to date, and will be going forward, although I think the emphasis is going to be changing going forward, has really come from the investment community. And the investment community is not finance. It is part of finance, but it's not finance. The banking bit of finance is huge, and the insurance part is pretty big as well. And obviously investment's important as well, but there is a lot more to finance than just investment. Just investment is an important thing. And the other thing is that these subsectors, if you want to call it, have very different perspectives on life, the universe, and everything. They have very different cultures, they have very different risk appetites. And I think that's reflected in the way that initiatives have been developing to date. So we've had the responsible investment community and activities for a long time. Initially, it was a lot very close to ethical investment. So it's about not investing in activities that were deemed to be undesirable, alcohol, gambling, those sorts of things, latterly climate change, those sorts of issues. So there is that history there, and divestment is still a tool within the investment armory. But actually that's changing, and there's a much more informed approach, I would say, actually looking at what is the responsibility of the investors and how can they support the transition to sustainability, rather than saying, oh, we're just holding all tech shares and everything's wonderful. Actually, should we be working with these sectors that have a role in sustainability or need to transition, and how can we influence them and support them? So I think it's a change of mindset within that community. The investment community, I think, starts from a position of thinking about opportunity. So it's looking at, can it develop new services? Can it develop new products? Can it develop funds? And that's the way it's thinking. And there is a lot of money looking for good homes going forward, not just because it's a good idea from a long-term strategic perspective internally, but also reflecting consumer sentiment as well. People want to know that their money's doing good and part of the transition. So I think that's happening. Within the investment world, there's quite a heavy reliance on third-party data providers, and quite often they have proprietary approaches to ESG. So I think we're probably at the stage now where companies are being faced with more than one ESG approaches, and they're not necessarily all compatible, if I put it politely like that. But I think moving forward, there is a lot of sense that this isn't a great situation, and there is quite a push to think, how can we make data collection consistent, and how can we make sure that we're all relying on the same data and it's good quality and so on. That'll be around the climate space first, for sure, but then as it expands, it will look at the other elements of sustainability as well. So I think that's the investment world. Developments like the taxonomy, EU taxonomy is a big one, but there are lots of other taxonomies as well. There are issues around taxonomies about what's green and not green, and we could talk for hours about that. But I think one of the things that I found, particularly with the EU taxonomy, is the technical guidance that supports it is great. So you've got a massive sector by sector discussion on how a good company in this sector should operate. I mean, it's limited at the minute, but it's a really good technical resource for people looking at this. Not just those that want to say something's green or not green. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. But like I mentioned in the title of the presentation, this is supposed to be about TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And that reflects a more banking and insurance kind of focus towards risk. So whereas I think it isn't a binary thing, but from the investment community, you'd be looking at, what sort of products, what sort of funds can we develop? From a banking and insurance, the first response would be, what are the risks associated with this, and how do we respond to it, and how do we manage it? And TCFD really came out of that from a high level concern about whether climate risks in the first instance posed a financial risk to the whole stability of the global finance. So it's actually an important thing to recognize that it's actually talking about financial risks rather than impacts. And I think the whole debate that's come out of TCFD is really, really interesting, not fully resolved, but there is a real difference between what might be a financial risk to a bank or an insurer or an investor and what the actual impacts on the environment or on local communities might be. And that's tied up with some of the debate that we heard earlier about materiality of social issues. So understanding materiality and the discussion and debate that's going on around deciding what is material for an organization, non-financial reporting, is really central to this and central to what TCFD might develop into. And I'm guessing there are a number of organizations represented today that are already producing TCFD reports, and if so, that's great. And you are positioning yourself well to deal with the anticipated challenges that I think will be coming from the finance sector in the future. However, I would say that a lot of the reports that I've certainly seen do cover the main elements that are covered in the TCFD guidance about strategy, governance, and impacts. And that's great. But I also look at them with a banking or an insurance kind of hat on and think, I can't understand the risk from this disclosure. And that's what they want to be doing. And it comes back to the things, echoing what people have been saying today. A lot of the risk is going to sit in the supply chain. And if you don't understand where your supply chain is and what the relationships are and what the dependencies are down the supply chain, you can't understand the risk associated with the organization and where the impacts are. So it's not just about own organization, it's about the whole value chain. And as you were saying earlier, that on the opportunity side, how this actually links to strategy. So is this an organization that's going to be around in a few years or 10 years or 20 years or 30 years? Is it producing the materials that are going to be needed, or is it in an area that's going to disappear or be much more heavily regulated or have restricted demand? So those are the sorts of questions that I don't think come through strongly yet in most TCFD reports. That's not surprising. It's still early-ish days, but that is going to come through, assuming we get a good TCFD. And on the question of sort of mandatory and legal requirements about TCFD, the UK is actually government's consulting at the minute on making TCFD mandatory. In a way, I think that's a red herring, because assuming we do get this good TCFD, the banks and the insurers and the investors are going to want to know this information anyway. And there probably is going to be a condition of making loans or offering insurance covers or prior to investment. So it's actually getting this into the mainstream, I think, could actually be an absolutely fundamental step forward in the sector supporting transition to sustainability. Now, I was just going to say 2 or 3 quick things at the end. I'm actually saying completely different to what I'd written the notes for, reflecting what people said earlier. So hopefully that's okay. I think some of the areas where the work going on within the finance sector now might be of broader interest and use to other sectors, I probably couldn't have said very much a few years ago. In fact, I would have struggled to say, you know, what can we tell you about this? But I think the work thinking about timescales, how to accommodate different timescales in impact, that, you know, what's near term, what's longer term, and how you address those in terms of strategy, risk appetite, and so on is a really interesting area. Scenario analysis, absolutely centrally as a way, an approach of dealing with uncertain futures. And so I think if I look at some of the materials that are out there, I'd certainly suggest it's worth a look at the TCFD hub. There's masses of information on there, but I think particularly within that, there's the CFRF, the Climate Financial Risk Forum. I get some acronyms in, and there's the sort of state of the art, I would say, particularly around scenario analysis, about strategy, about governance and everything else. So there's some really good stuff there. I think it gives an indication of, assuming we get a good TCFD, the way it's going to go. But I think so it'll inform what organizations are going to be asked. But as well as that, it's actually quite forward-thinking stuff as well. So I think it would be interesting, for instance, around scenario analysis. So mindful of the time, and apologies for going on, I leave it at that, and thank you for the opportunity for talking.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Paul. Round of applause, ladies and gents, from behind your microphones for the fabulous Paul Pritchard. So Paul, we've been, by the way, if anybody's thinking, sorry, what is TCFD, etc.
Oh.
No, it's all good. We have been putting the links, and I feel very smug that we had the link to the TCFD hub in the chat before you mentioned it. So that's a case there where these are all rules, regulations, etc., that are coming through in that financial space, and they've literally only come in the last 12 months or so. And so actually pushing the world of banking, insurance, etc., to perhaps shine more transparency with regards to, say, climate change. Is that correct, Paul?
Absolutely. I mean, TCFD has been around for a few years, but it's kind of been kicked around what it means. And, you know, within the sector, the focus tends to be on portfolios rather than individual companies. So there's a lot of interest in how you can look at a portfolio of organizations by sector and so on. So there's been quite a lot of area in that, which I think has meant that the pressures haven't yet fed through from the sector other than in the investment world. So the ESG questionnaires and everything that are coming through, there's actually this TCFD, if I can say it properly, stuff coming down further down the line in the next year or two. And then after that, we've got the task force on nature related financial disclosures. So that's following down, that's likely to appear next year, and kind of extends it to looking at more nature related issues as well.
And when you mentioned right at the beginning that the social side is perhaps a little bit absent at the moment. When do you think more of the social aspects might be coming through in that?
Well, it is interesting because I think there was a lot of discussion around materiality and how do you define materiality and what does materiality mean? And historically, materiality would mean for a bank or for an insurer mean something that results in a loss of greater than X million pounds or something like that. That's a material issue. And if it didn't result in that within a 1 to 3 year timescale, it's not material. So clearly that doesn't work for an issue like climate change or indeed for social issues. Of course, you can still get legal cases and you know, employee issues and supply chain and local, you can get all those, but it doesn't usually register. So the discussion on materiality, and there's been some very good guidance come out recently from the Financial Reporting Advisory Group, EFRAG, about materiality and about non-financial materiality. So this is the interests of third parties that might not result in a direct financial loss to the organization, operational loss, but who need to be taken into account. So I think the social issues will come through that route and be integrated in it. And also as well, when you get the nature related stuff, you know, water issues is one area where I think this will come through very early, and local rights and things related to water are actually going to come through pretty strongly from looking at climate. They're all interconnected anyway. So.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Paul. And I noted Susan's eyebrow twitch when you mentioned that word materiality and what it means, because actually the word materiality means different things to different people. Yeah. And I think that's something that is crucial for all of us to acknowledge. But you make a fantastic point there, Paul. So brilliant. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the fantastic Paul Pritchard. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. So Paul has given us an insight into the world of finance, which of course in finance isn't just investment, it is all also banking and insurance and things like that. And don't worry, Paul, we don't think that you are the devil or anything like that, being our token banker in the room or anything, don't worry. But it's fantastic to see some of the changes that have been going on in that world. We now welcome to the stage the brilliant James Fryer, who is going to give us insight from the insurance side of things, because there's been some development going on there, or certainly there are lots of levers that the world of insurance can pull to ensure that our raw materials are sourced, etc., in a responsible way. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the fantastic James Fryer.
Thank you, Sarah. So we are the devil, of course, being in insurance, as Paul's lamenting the fact that being in finance meant that he got his boos. You know, I can already hear the boos being louder. The participant numbers are dropping off a cliff edge. So yes, I am simply an insurance salesman. And in contrast to this afternoon's speakers and panelists, I'm certainly no expert in sustainability and ESG issues, which I'm afraid rather belies the fact that insurance still has a long way to go in these issues. And we are perhaps, as Paul was saying, where he was in finance several years ago. I think that's probably where we still are. But that's not to say that we aren't starting to do a lot of good things, and we need to drive these issues forward. I admit that, you know, I find the whole question over sustainability and ESG certainly intriguing, massively important, of course, but from my perspective as an engineer, as an insurance salesman, I find it rather ephemeral. And I say that in the sense that, yeah, I can't hit it with a hammer. And it seems in many aspects that it just seems that we should be doing these things. It's the right thing to do. So why aren't we doing it? So having said that, so just a brief introduction. I am a mining specialist underwriter with CNA Hardy, which is a combination of a very large US insurer, but also Hardy's syndicate in Lloyd's of London. My background is engineering, but I've been working in insurance now for more than 20 years, and specializing in mining for the majority of those years. So what I want to do today, I appreciate we don't have a lot of time, but then I've not really got that much to say. But what I want to do is give consideration to the role that financial institutions and mining and insurance specifically has, or certainly could have, in promoting positive ESG development. And I'll probably echo a lot of the sentiments that a lot of people have already said this afternoon. So as a specialist insurance underwriter, I mean, being in insurance doesn't make me a popular dinner party guest. And for long term, I struggled with, you know, am I a useful member of society selling insurance? And I came to terms with it because, there is a point to all this, but I came to terms with it because the financial security and protection that we provide today allows investment tomorrow. And among those things is investment in ESG issues. So which we're providing that security to enable companies to do that. And that's rather a passive effect of insurance, but there are at least two other ways, I think, in which insurance can help with this whole question. Firstly, is the role of insurance companies as investors. Any insurance company will have a business model within which there's a significant issue of them being able to use the premiums that they receive in order to then go forward and invest. And I know, as Paul was saying, that it's moving towards more kind of greener and ethical investments is well established. It's auditable. That's not what I want to concentrate here today on. What I do want to talk about is the role that insurance underwriting can have in promoting and perhaps leveraging improvements in ESG and sustainability among the companies that we insure. it's sometimes quite difficult to know who has the worst reputation, insurance companies or mining companies. At least among the common man or woman on the street. And I think somebody said it earlier that mining companies perhaps haven't been the best at promoting themselves in all the good things that they do, because all we see is headline news about people being trapped underground and explosions and pollution and all those things. But having worked in both sectors, I definitely think insurers have the worst reputation. And I say that because mining companies have done a great deal of work in the last years, decades, in improvements. And if a mining company can't maintain its social license to operate, then it's going to find itself in a really difficult position to be able to continue mining. And without doubt, my mining clients are spending a lot more time these days, as opposed to what they were doing 10 years ago, in terms of the amount of time that they're spending talking to me about sustainability and ESG issues. A great example was I was talking to Sibanye-Stillwater, Elaine, yesterday, not that you were on the call, but I was talking to your colleagues about their insurance renewal, and we spent a lot of time talking about sustainability, as I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear. And I really do get the impression that it's not just them saying these things, they're actually doing it as well. I think that really comes across. Having said that, as an insurance company, as an underwriter, I find it can be quite difficult to validate those credentials, given the extent of greenwashing that sometimes fails to stand up to that scrutiny. And of course, there's a growing cohort of organisations that can audit and score both qualitatively and quantitatively on those issues. But within the insurance industry, we don't routinely use those tools that may be available. And so what we do with that information is we file it, and it's very much more of a tick box exercise. Which leads me on to where do I think we are as an insurance industry in using that sustainability and ESG information that's provided to us, and what do we do about it? And I think we're very much in a position of short-term compliance. We will do what we are required to do, and we won't do anything any further than that. We don't want to get ourselves into a position where we have bad PR because we've been caught out. So we do what we need to do, and that's as far as it goes. And I think we've moved away from a state of shareholder capitalization to one of the stakeholder. And that means that we are coming under a lot more pressure from a lot more diverse interests. And that may be our customers and business partners, it may be our employees, it may be the wider society, NGOs, our peers and other insurance companies, or emerging market standards. But I think being pressurized into a decision, and in fact it becomes no decision at all, doesn't necessarily provide a good outcome, and there certainly can be unforeseen consequences as a result of otherwise overtly good decisions, certainly good intentions. And I'll raise the issue of coal and insurance, which is a significant issue at the moment. So under a number of years of intense pressure from various pressure groups and NGOs, personally I would say verging on the bullying, many insurers and reinsurers have been forced into having an underwriting policy on coal. And sometimes that's just thermal coal, sometimes it's thermal and metallurgical. Sometimes people don't know the difference, particularly once you move up the ivory tower and you go into the boardrooms, coal just becomes coal. And what that does, it restricts the availability of insurance capacity for coal mining companies. And it raises the cost of that capacity. So insurance premiums increase. The consequences being that because we're not there able to provide them with that financial security and protection, they then can't go on and invest in transitioning to better, safer, cleaner technologies. I'll come back to that point, I think. With the best will in the world, coal is going to be a significant part of our energy mix for many years to come, notwithstanding the fact that obviously coal is used in many other industries, steel production, cement production, hydrogen, aluminium, the use of activated carbon for air and water purification, the list goes on. So by restricting that investment opportunity in the financial protection, I'm not sure we're necessarily in a better place. So where's my point here? I think we're in this compliance position. We shouldn't be in a compliance position. We should look at ESG very much as an opportunity. But we need to be able to work out how we do that. We need to work out how to embed it into our day-to-day underwriting activities. And I think and again, echoing a previous comment, if people are doing the right thing in terms of sustainability and ESG, then surely the results are going to be better and more tangible for us as insurers because we have less losses. Now, we already do this in many other aspects of insurance. So we employ risk engineers and they go out to our insured locations and they make recommendations for risk improvements. And then when it comes to the insurance renewal, underwriters will look at the responses to those recommendations, the implementation of those recommendations, and certainly in part that will then dictate the availability of insurance capacity and the price for that capacity. And more specifically, we've already mentioned the global industry standard on tailings management, but we are requiring our mining companies that we insure to comply with some very rigorous standards around the design, the operation and maintenance and management of tailings dams. If they don't do that, then potentially they don't have access to that insurance coverage. So we're using that as that leverage to make positive change in risk management and safety. And there's no reason why we can't use that similar leverage on ESG. Now, that makes me sound like the bully again. So I was complaining about the bullies earlier. But what I would say is that if our insureds are willing to transition, if they're willing to make positive changes, then we work with them through that transition phase, recognizing that that change doesn't come overnight. Some of the things that we are asking them to do in order to improve and get better can take many years, but we will work with them through that journey. I think individually underwriters do some of this on an ad hoc manner. And for example, I wouldn't knowingly insure a mining company that I knew had a poor environmental track record or had human rights breaches, but I can't prove that in a systematic policy, and neither can I relate my underwriting to on individual companies to any kind of quantitative score on energy efficiency, health and safety, financial reporting, whatever it may be. But what we do need to do is we have to have that cultural shift within the insurance community that has that poor reputation of being very commercial and perhaps being quite unethical. But if we have that cultural shift, which is backed up by the availability of independently audited credentials, then that will help us along the way significantly. It's worked for the more traditional risk improvement, tailings dam issues that I mentioned. Yeah, we have seen significant improvements within the mining industry, partly as a result of that insurance leverage. Whether that can work for ESG will remain to be seen. I think we can, because we see other financial sectors moving in that direction. But as I said at the beginning, I think we find ESG perhaps a little more intangible in the context of the manifestation of the insurance losses that have come through. If we say to a mining company, you have to put sprinkler protection in your warehouse, and if they don't, it burns down to the ground, we can see a direct correlation there. I'm not sure that we can necessarily see the same correlation with the insured losses coming through. There's more of that indirect link. But we're starting to engage within my role as the chairman of the Mining Insurance and Risk Association. we're starting to talk to a lot more people about sustainability and ESG issues. We do have a long way to go, but maybe, just maybe, at some point in the future, then insurers can become the good guys. Hard to believe, but maybe we can. Thank you.
Brilliant. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the fantastic James Fryer. Brilliant. I should also note, for anybody here who's not British, there was a slight element of sarcasm in some of what James was saying there, but also lots of elements of truth as well. So thank you, James. Just time for a couple of questions here, and there's one that's come in from John Clark, and actually just building on what you were saying about tailings dams. And he asks, he says, would your company, or perhaps if you don't want to talk specifically about your organization, would you be able to get insurance for an upstream tailings dam, given that, say, Brazil has outlawed future upstream tailings dams?
Absolutely, because there are many, many upstream tailings dams that operate perfectly well. Where we would question the risk safety factor of upstream dams is where they are constructed in seismically active zones, and also how they've been designed and operated, and all the risk factors that go with that. So we would second guess ourselves on covering an upstream tailings dam in Peru, for example, but probably not so much of an issue in Australia.
Okay, thank you for that, James. So then coming on to how do you get, so obviously the Global Tailings Review has really helped insurance, I guess, to find that tangibility in terms of actually how do you get your arms around what do you insure, what don't you insure, or where do you go looking for those extra controls in terms of managing those different aspects of risk? Is this something then where mining as a sector needs to get better at making ESG more tangible? Would that help insurance come on board and get to grips a little bit more with where insurance can really help us?
I think it would, because we're dealing with numbers at the end of the day. We're dealing with risk, but we quantify that into numbers that we can understand. So unless we have that more tangible evidence, it's difficult to do that. We've been speaking to the Church of England, for example, on exactly how to implement the new global standard on tailings management, because it's all very well having the standards, but there are significant questions to be answered about how it's implemented, and then how do mining companies prove compliance with the standard. So it is having that data, and the insurance industry is moving ahead with better use of data. Anyone that is a new car driver that requires a black box in their car in order to get insurance, that's the way things are going. I can foresee a position where we have something for the mining industry, and maybe we have something akin to a black box for the way that mills are operated, or furnaces, or data from tailings dams in terms of readings from piezometers and extensometers, and all these different things. That data is key. But we already have a lot of data, but I'm not sure we're very good at using it. So it's both the availability of data and how we use it and interpret it.
And with that data, James, so last question is this data that you would expect to be provided by the person you're insuring or the asset you're insuring, or is it something where insurance has an appetite to go and source its own data to almost get that third party verification as to, what are the emissions, for example, coming out of a processing plant? Do you rely on that processing plant telling you, or do you go and get, say, the satellite derived emissions data to go and check up on what that asset is doing?
No, absolutely. Look, as part of insurance, there's a duty of disclosure upon the insureds to give us correct information. But we also recognise that mining companies use third parties, for their own non-destructive testing. There's already well-established procedures for third parties to come in to audit tailings dams and the management thereof. So we also access those third parties. If we had access to a third party that was able to provide us with data and interpretation in a consistent manner that can be used throughout the insurance industry, then I think we'd get a much, much better take up of the use of that information. And therefore, what we will then be able to do is we'll be able to differentiate between those mining companies that are doing the right things, and they can be scored, and what they're saying does stand up to scrutiny, as opposed to those that say the right things but don't do them. If that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. So brilliant. Thank you very, very much, James. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the fantastic James Fryer. Brilliant. Okay, so we are almost there, ladies and gentlemen. We are almost there. So we've had a little glimpse into what is meant by environment, social governance. Then what does it look like all rolled together from the mining perspective, and then the government or the legislative perspective, and then we look at banking and investment, and then insurance. But what about society as a whole, and especially what about communication with society as a whole? So our final formal speaker of today is the fantastic Professor Ian Stewart. You may recognise him from the telly, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, so he's the man who does rocks on the television. Sorry, Ian, I could have built it up a bit more than that, couldn't I? But ladies and gents, please put your hands together for the wonderful Ian Stewart. He's going to come off mute. Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, he will come off mute and we'll be able to hear him as well. There he is. He's finding it.
I'm only a professor of communication and I can't press my mute button. Yeah, thanks for that. It's been great sitting in on this today. It's kind of like a support group for people, flotsam and jetsam of the mining world scattered around, where we all say how, no, it is important. It's been fascinating listening to the discussions in different aspects. My interest is, as you said, Sarah, on how we communicate technical knowledge to non-technical audience, so specialists to non-specialists, scientists to non-scientists. And I guess where I'm in relation to you guys is I'm upstream. So I'm in the universities, and my interest is how we train the next kind of generation, the people that are coming down, going to be working in the industry, about how we communicate. And, I think it's come up several times that maybe we think that in the past we haven't done such a good job. And for a lot of people, the issue of communication is such a fundamental one that it seems to be a real asperity in much of the things that we do. So I'm just going to, I've got a couple of slides just to offer up a provocation, really. Maybe Sarah, you can tell us if you can see this full screen.
Yep, it looks beautiful. Thanks.
Fantastic. So I'm interested in how we communicate what we know to those that we want to try to influence. And so I'm going to explain these three horizons in a few minutes. But behind me is the Salar de Uyuni up in the Bolivian Altiplano, which is, it's got to be one of the most beautiful places on the planet, really. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But the reason why it's important, as everyone on this platform will know, is because it's also home to 30%, maybe of that region's 30% of the world's lithium reserves. And as we go for the energy transition, we move to the low carbon future in electric vehicles, and that light mineral metal lithium is going to be increasingly important. And so, society is going to face really quite considerable questions and debates really in the coming years about where it gets its energy and its materials from. As someone said, any future that's got less carbon in it has got a hell of a lot more mining in it. And I don't think most people have appreciated that. Most people out in the street really have appreciated that. So the question then is, how do we communicate some of these issues? And it's probably worthwhile just stepping back a little bit to think, well, how have we approached this problem from an academic point of view? And I've tried to summarize this in this diagram here. So it really shows on the vertical axis, it's what's the motivation of specialist or a scientist. So down the bottom, it's pursuit of knowledge, it's pure academic interest, curiosity, serendipity. And at the top, it's driven by specific problems given to it by society. And then along the vertical axis is the extent to which the public is actually invited into the process. So very low over on the left-hand side to high on the right. So in that bottom left corner is the space which is where the academics live. And so there's what we refer to that as the public understanding of science sector. And in that sector, we've got scientists who decide what they want to get knowledge about. It's a knowledge production area where it's driven entirely internally by the internal interests of the academics. They create this knowledge, and then the expectation is twofold. One is that the benefits of that knowledge will trickle down somehow magically into wider society. And then the assumption that underpins that public understanding of science model is that the reason the public don't agree with the experts, the specialists, is because they just don't have the same information. So that if you provide that information to them, then everything will be fine, and the public will see the same world the same way as the experts do. The only trouble with that is it's found to be completely not fit for purpose in many of the applied nature of it. And so public communication or science communication had a new model that emerged really in the 90s called public engagement, which was about dialogue, which said, look, let's forget about educating the public. Let's just invite them into science. Let's get them think that science is cool, and we'll get them in. So I'm a geologist, so it's all about dinosaurs and volcanoes and things like that. Let's get them interested in this. And as kind of Sarah's alluded to, I've kind of made a 15, 20-year career really of that kind of stuff. But the problem is that again is really driven by us and trying to think about what the public are interested in now. And many of the issues that we deal with are really complicated, and they're not easy to just be simply translated. The other thing that's really come out in, I guess, the last 20, 30 years is the full understanding from, admittedly, the human sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, of how people make decisions and take information on board or don't take information on board. So this just summarizes some of those heuristics. These situations that they find themselves in when they're making decisions are often time poor, got to act fast, massive amounts of data out there, much of the data is uncertain, and there's usually a lot of fear and emotion. And so as a result of that, the process they go through is one where when the information is complex, they base it on their gut instinct, their values and beliefs. They'll really then look to confirm their values by finding information that tells them they've made the right kind of fast thinking decision. And the shortcut, cognitive shortcut, that is trust. So finding people that they trust and that share some values. And that doesn't, of course, have to be experts. In fact, often it's not the experts because they come from a different world and they don't get trusted. It's their friends, it's their family, it's their influencers, it's media influencers, etc. And so the net problem that we have is the fact that decisions really that are opinions that aren't formed by logic or facts aren't influenced by logical factual arguments. And that's a real problem for us because in our technical training, we emphasize logical factual arguments above more or less everything else. In other words, if we can create things as a logical factual arguments, then surely that is what is going to compel people. But the evidence out there, the empirical evidence, suggests that there's a whole bunch of other things that really determine whether people accept information or not. And there's a whole set of nested decision-making areas really that influence that. So for me, one of the fundamental things was that's changed really was in 2015. So 2015 is the Paris Climate Agreement. It was in December, but before that, in June was the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and in September was the Global Sustainable Development Goals. So these are three global frameworks where society sets out a very specific roadmap for science and technology to deliver on for a better, more equitable world. And that's really caused quite a lot of debate really within science about this kind of model, because it's to say that this is a version of the similar one that I showed before, but we had down in the bottom left, we've got standard science, mode 1 science driven by academics. Then there's some science that's maybe inspired by what users want, and then pure applied. But a new world had opened up, really, the world of what's called co-production, so with stakeholders, and social learning. So actually it's undertaking learning not in the academic context, but actually in the social context. And this is all referred to as kind of post-normal science or transformative science. But what's hard about all of this is to try and work out what we actually do. How does that then translate into what people teach, what we teach, and also how we deal with communication? So my contention, or my provocation really, is to see 3 communication fields that essentially build on each of them and become more sophisticated. So the academic side, the academic core, is what I refer to as make and sell. What that is basically that science and universities and academics and professionals, we generate knowledge. It's not been asked, that specific knowledge hasn't been asked for by the public. We've internally generated, we decided we want to have this, and then we sell it out the door. And we do that by draping it in lots of journalistic, use journalistic skills to write really compelling narratives. We've got amazing imagery, but we are selling it to a public that essentially paid for it through their taxes, but didn't ask for it. So we make it very digestible, and we allow the public to consume this science, but it's very much one way. It's our science that we're asking the public to consume. The next model out is referred to as sense and respond, and that really reflects the fact that there's lots of empirical data there around what actually works and what doesn't work. We get that from psychology and sociology, and I just touched on it. And so basically what there is to say, look, who's your audience? Understand your audience. If you understand your audience, then you can tailor your communication devices to that. But actually, at the end of the day, all you're still doing is still delivering that message from science to that audience. You're just doing it in a more sophisticated way, more targeted way. So the last one, these are all kind of marketing paradigms from business. The other marketing paradigm that's come along really in the last 20 years is referred to as guide and co-create. And this is the area, and it's been mentioned earlier on today, ethical marketing, social marketing, whereby the guide part is a sense of long-term leadership, a direction of travel that a company, that a business decides to take. But recognizes that in order to get there, it has to take the customer base with it. It has to co-create the narrative, the journey with their customer base. And we've already heard what the driving force of that is. I heard it earlier on about purpose. And so these are purpose-led organizations. Now, what's interesting, I think, in this is that the skill set, communication skill set in a guide and co-create model is very different to the communication skill set in make and sell. So in guide and co-create, it's around truly interdisciplinary thinking, blurring all of the interdisciplinary, it's really transdisciplinary. It's been genuinely participatory about lots of different voices inside. It's about being reflexive. It's about skills of negotiation and conciliation, because it's about dialogue and discussion. So in trying to look at this then, this is a much more nuanced and layered set of communication skills that I think we need to be conveying to the professionals that come through our system. And I put this, I think we went back. I put this up. This was something that the 3 Horizons, which John Elkington has showed at a conference recently, and John's allowed us to do this. This is the 3 Horizons that look, basically the 3 Horizons are horizons that sit in the present, but project towards the future. So the one at the top, which is Horizon 1, is business as usual. It's how we are now. So if you look at that there, it's the world of shareholders, it's dependent on fossil fuel, GDP growth is king, and the result of that is inequality of wealth and many of the issues that we've been talking about. The orange line is the horizon which is emerging, and it's an entrepreneurial space where people who understand the limitations or appreciate there are limitations with business as usual, and so are trying to innovate into a new space. And you can see things about new technologies, new accounting frameworks, ESG becoming mainstream kicks in there. But underpinning that is the new paradigm that's coming in, that's going to sweep in, the one that's going to transform it and overtake and become the next prevailing paradigm. And that horizon 3 is the visionary space, and it's things that are just seen at the moment as weak signals. So the well-being economy, for example, that certain governments, Finland, Iceland, Scotland, New Zealand and Wales, have started to look at in terms of legislative. But it's also things like the social movements that are starting to build around social inequity, and things like Black Lives Matter and the climate strikes. So the interest then is the entrepreneurial space can go either way. It can get co-opted and brought back into the managerial space of business as usual to allow what's happening now to sustain itself a little bit, or it could be deviated into this new emergent paradigm and help accelerate through the new world that's essentially coming, essentially the world of the SDGs and on well-being. So I just put this out because what I'm interested in then is how these communicate, the way we communicate, the skill sets that we think around fit with that. So to my mind, 95% of the science communication that comes out of universities and research organizations is make and sell. They're trying to sustain business as usual through lots of imaginative, creative thinking, but actually it's really one-dimensional. We can learn to do sense and respond. We can learn to be smarter about working out what people want, and that will carry us on for a little bit longer. But ultimately, that will probably just help sustain make and sell. The challenge is going to be how we start to inculcate the skills of guide and co-creation into the kind of new sets of professionals coming through. And for that, I think one of the things that is required is essentially that universities have to become purpose-led organizations. And so I think with that contention, I'll stop.
That was one hell of a note to stop on there, Ian, in terms of rescoping universities. But a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for fantastic Ian Stewart. That was absolutely brilliant, Ian.
Thanks,
and I have to confess as well, so during your talk, I have just bought Green Swans in terms of that book that only came out last month, because that looks fantastic. Ian, just on that, in terms of that move towards the guide and co-create, do you have any hints, tips, or resources, for example, that we can take a look at that would help us better understand what that really means, or how to be able to move into that space more?
I think there's a few emergent areas. I mean, it's a dialogic space, and so a lot of the work that happens in terms of genuinely community dialogue. So the trouble with a lot of the dialogic work I think that happens at the moment in the mining space is that it's kind of instrumentalized listening. So it's a set of listening that's put out there, but actually the people doing the listening aren't really interested in what's coming back. They're interested in finding out what problems are so they can target their messaging better. So we need to create a better listening environment, and that seems at first glance to be very much against the whole thing about communication, which is how do you get your stuff out there. So I think there are things that are doing it. I've been really impressed with. Was involved in the Scottish Climate Assembly. I was the communications lead there, and that was really interesting watching 100 normal, everyday people, demographically representative, so actually in part of that also represented about how they felt about climate change. So some think it's complete rubbish, tax dodge, some people absolutely fired up, and most people just in the messy middle. But let's watching 100 people over the course of 6 weekends work through the information and increase the deliberative space that they had to talk through this thing and come out with, in the end, a whole suite of really quite radical actions, far more radical than the Scottish government has got at the moment. So the Scottish government will have to come back to that. One of them, for example, is encouraging the Scottish government to move away from GDP as a metric of success into well-being. So I think that my confidence is that we've got mechanisms that we can use this, but we just haven't developed them to any great degree.
Okay, and I mean, that's something where, just to signpost some of the talks that are coming on later in the week. So I think everything you've just described, Ian, is fantastic. And there are actually quite a lot of tools and techniques, and I'm looking at Susan here, that have been coming from the sort of the social space in terms of how do you create those dialogue tables, or those that sort of ecosystem in which people can co-create in a way and discover together. And so therefore perhaps all feel they have ownership in terms of what's being driven forwards. So I don't know, I think there's some really nice kind of cross learning between these different avenues here, which is fantastic. So Ian, I'm going to keep you on the line because we're about to go into our panel session. But before we do that, ladies and gents, please put your hands together for the fabulous Ian Stewart.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was great. So now we're going to go into the final session of today. And so this is our panel session. And as you can see, our fabulous speakers who are still with us have turned on their videos, but we've also been joined by Kat Bell, who is not an interloper. We have invited her very purposefully. So Kat, if you want to find that mute button. So Kat is here with two hats on. So firstly, she does work within Rio Tinto, so one of the world's largest mining companies, and has got huge experience with regards to working inside Rio Tinto, but is also the founder of the Young Mining Professionals Network as well. So Kat, I don't know if you want to quickly introduce yourself so that we all know who you are, and then I'm just going to invite you for any comments on things that have resonated with you from the talks that you've managed to catch at the end of today's session. So Kat, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure, thanks Sarah, really appreciate being invited. I hope you can all hear me.
Yep.
Yes, great. So yeah, Kat Bell, I'm a geologist by background, so I know there's a few in the panel, and but yeah, have been working across various different roles in mining for the last 10 years. And I started Young Mining Professionals in the UK a few years ago, but really, what drives me, so my passion is to try and collaborate across the globe with the new entrants into the mining sector and ensure that mining in the future is that sustainable, the ideal mining vision that we all have, and what tools can we equip the new entrants coming in to realize that mission, as they're going to be the leaders of the future. So that's my primary purpose, I suppose, and sort of the day job just comes along with that. But in terms of what's resonated today, look, I think, and I unfortunately I didn't manage to capture the first two speakers, but it's the I suppose everyone who's been invited does have a passion around at least one element of this, but it just seems that there's so much good progress that has been made, lots of people coming together, although we're sort of at this sort of I feel like it's like we're almost about to take off in terms of how we all collaborate. And I think, this conferences like this and just the volume of people having these really, really important conversations is only ever going to be, beneficial in how we can all collectively achieve the aims of more responsible sourcing. I was just listening to Ian's talk in terms of communication. I just think that's such an important one. And in terms of the co-creating that narrative, I was thinking how do we actually reach out to those that are going to be really affected by this message and create it with them in terms of changing the narrative around mining. I think that's a really, I'm struggling to think quite how we make that first engagement, because getting the adversaries and everyone who isn't necessarily, of course, the benefits mining can bring to the table to have that discussion and start that element of co-creation, I think is an interesting question. So that's my initial reflections. Thanks, Sarah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kat. We'll come back to you in a second, but I'm going to take you up on that question that you were posing to Ian there and say, perhaps Ian, if you are trying to work with people who really, they don't like mining or they don't like what it is that you're talking about, do you have any suggestions as to how you begin to address that? And perhaps also the co-creation is one of those avenues that can be explored.
Yeah, I think it requires, from our side, a complete mindset change. It was touched on earlier when we talked about the social environment, and I think that make and sell territory is the mindset is education. We just need to educate them. The interesting one, the one I find most problematic, is the sense and respond, which is essentially about persuasion. How do we persuade them that we're right? And we do that through, as was pointed out, highlighting the economic contributions, the social contributions, all that stuff. But actually what we don't tend to do is like start off with a discussion about, actually, is it the right thing? And this notion of having it around equity and the human rights and things like that is a really powerful, and if you're going to go there, you have to start the conversation in that community about what is right for them. And it's really hard, to get companies and universities and researchers to do that, because we are trained to be the expert, to be the specialist. So to shed all that, put it aside, and then just to talk to people about what's good for them. I think other people around us screen will have more experience in that, but I think that's really difficult.
No, I'm going to come straight to Susan, actually, maybe to comment on this, because I think that there's that case of we've seen plenty of mining companies change the mine design, etc., as they've been listening to local communities, where they've gone, actually, yeah, maybe our initial way of doing this wasn't the right way, type thing. So kind of that listening backwards actually then helps to improve whatever is the outcome. I don't know, Susan, if you got any thoughts on what Ian's just said.
Yeah, I mean, I think the critical line in the sand is we've got more examples of adjusting and adapting something once the decision's already made, because we actually started to listen to people, and we knew that we could make the impacts less serious or do more to accommodate. I don't know of, I think companies are starting to get to the point where they are seriously going to engage communities before they make the big investments and get so far down the road with the capital at stake that they are no longer in a position financially to feel like they can walk away. And this might be an interesting question for Elaine, because Newmont is certainly one of those companies that has been working on this. So the question is, do we yet have an example of a mine that has been brought into production with a pre-agreed, fully, it would never be 100%, but with sort of a pre-agreed engagement process that led to a number of trade-offs and agreements about what will this look like and what will it look like after closure, and I think also bringing that full arc of this is a temporary activity, and where does it get us at the end of that activity? Are we as a community, as a people, better off at that point? And is that a choice that we will make as an interim activity to get us to where we want to be? And how local is that decision? Is that decision really local, regional, national? We're still figuring it out. And I really appreciated Ian's insights on the communication piece, because it really gave me some new conceptual language to wrap around what we see going on.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Susan. That's fantastic. And Elaine, you know that I'm going to take that beautiful question that Susan just teed up there and pass it straight across to you, if you want to answer even just an incy-wincy aspect of it.
Well, I think there are mining companies that are, we're still learning how to do this. You have to listen to people, you have to listen early, you have to demonstrate that you're willing to change your plans. There are examples of mining companies that have walked away from assets or properties when they didn't have community agreement. Rio Tinto has at least one strong example of that. And I think Newmont has said, recently, the CEO, in British Columbia, that, you know, if they truly are not wanted, that they won't develop their assets. You know, I can't speak for either of those companies right now, but there are examples of that. But, you know, it's really difficult to change your mindset. You know, if you're truly doing free, prior, and informed consent, you know, you're having those conversations before the geologists even know they really have something that's economic to develop. And that's a really hard thing to figure out. How do you balance that? You know, because, you know, I don't know what the number is. Is it 1 in 1,000 exploration opportunities, you know, are worth taking further, and even fewer than that actually get developed? So it's really complicated, but I think the best companies are trying, are sincerely understanding they must listen better than they've listened in the past, and that you can't just throw money at a problem. You can't have transactional relationships that fall apart. That, you know, long-term success is built on building trust, and trust is built on not just what you say, but what you do.
Brilliant. Thanks with that, Elaine. Kat, maybe if I can come back to yourself, and especially on that comment that Elaine mentioned, that, you know, you need to be thinking about this stuff and considering it well before a geologist even knows that there may well be something in the ground. From your experience, do you have anything to build on that?
I think it's just absolutely, from the first boot on the ground, you're still having an impact on that community. And even if there's you know, the possibility that the likelihood that won't translate to a resource or then a mine, just that to be transparent completely with the objectives of the work that you're doing, and keeping and carrying the communities along with you on the journey and educating at every stage is just, I just think it's an absolute vital component of any exploration project. And, you know, fostering those relationships as early as possible will just make any sort of consent further down the line that much easier, because you will have those deep, trustful relationships, which are so important.
Thanks for that, Kat. So I think, I mean, this is also something as well where, because we're thinking about really big timeframes here, long timeframes, because as we know, it takes at least 10 years to go from someone saying, I think there might be something in the ground here, and with the permission to be able to get it out from the ground, through to a fully commissioned mine. So we're talking huge timescales that are perhaps, Ian, they align with those green swans, etc. Now, Paul, I know that you are itching to make a comment with regards to green swans, and then after that, perhaps Ludovine, if I can come to yourself, because I know you've got plenty of comments on this. So Paul.
Thank you. Well, it's yes, I'm quite excited about it, because for I suppose quite a sad reason, actually, that I guess certainly people in the UK will know about John Elkington. Well-respected, great communicator, triple bottom line, cannibals with forks. You know, he's been around. You know, he's done it all, hasn't he? And published it all. Great communicator. But I'm guessing fewer people actually know there is another Green Swans book that came out around the same time, and this is from the that excellent bunch of communicators known as the Bank for International Settlements, which is very transparent and has lots of co-creation in the production of all its documents, as I'm sure you can see. I still don't quite know how it operates, but they produced a Green Swan report, which has a slightly different, I mean, it was all done completely independently and it has a different view. But I look at the bank's report, and I read that, and I get more out of that than I got out of reading John Elkington's, because to me, this is about an absolutely fundamental global change to the way money's considered. And, you know, that would drive and practical considerations and all that. But I'm guessing it's probably reach beyond people in the banking and regulatory system is probably zero. So I don't know, there's this kind of conflict over, there's this really interesting stuff that is produced somewhere, I don't know where it was produced, and it comes out and it's really interesting, but I'm sure it does have traction with the European Central Bank and the regulators, but actually, could that be of interest to society, what this all means? I mean, I'm sure in its current form it isn't, but I think, you know, it could be. And it addresses things like timescales as well, because, you know, you're looking at capital requirements and matching assets and liabilities over a long time period, particularly if you're talking about project finance and things like that, and capital requirements. So anyway, sorry, I just wanted to throw that in because I never get to mention that report. And I don't think I've ever mentioned it, and I probably won't ever mention it again.
No, Paul, I think we're all going to go away and read that one now as well. And if you've got the link to it, please stick it into chat.
I will do. I will do.
Yeah. Fantastic. Ludovine, let's come to you for your comments. And then what we're going to do just to finish off is we're going to go around our virtual panel that we have here. And I'm going to ask you the one question, which is what ESG tool, so from your perspective, what ESG tool or approach do you think is having or has the potential to have the biggest impact on making ESG a reality? Okay, so if you can pick one, okay, or a few if you want, what is the single tool that will move this conversation or move reality on so that we're actually making ESG something that is real rather than just something that is talked about? So Ludovine, just come for your general comments first, and then perhaps I can start off with Susan for what ESG tool do you think will have the biggest impact or is having the biggest impact? So Ludovine, just for your general thoughts first.
Oh, sorry, my connection seems unstable. Yeah, general thoughts. It's just we've discussed a lot about you know, companies or projects and how they position, but the reality on the ground is that there's never a project or a company. There's usually, you know, a network of mining companies or exploration companies working in the same area. And so perhaps one of the things we could explore more as an industry is to build up better you know, united messages, more solidarity amongst operators, and to leverage off of one another's positive or negative experiences to you know, to allow people to understand mining over time rather than try to rewrite the book every single time we arrive somewhere. And as to the single most efficient or useful tool, well, of course, I'm going to say, you know, applying all the governance tools that there is, but I really continue to think that what's going to make the most change is stakeholders realizing that they never belong to a single category. So every single one of us is a consumer, every single one of us is a voter, every single one of us is potentially a policy activist. Every single one of us is an investor. We all have savings. So for me, it's more this notion that, you know, we are all connected through various aspects of this loop. So you're not making one-off decisions at one point. You're making a series of choices towards improving collective benefits over a whole value chain. It's not the same approach, and I think that will probably yield the most change in mentality.
Fantastic, thanks for that, Ludovine. Susan, what about your thoughts? And then we'll go to James.
Well, I might reflect a bit of a cynic after the years I've been in the industry, but I think it's activists, insurers, and investors that know their stuff and are pushing the substantive questions and the kind of things that you know, your speakers were talking about today, looking for verification. I think it's really shifting the bar. I know that's what I'm hearing, and I have, you know, mining companies that are saying that they're getting calls about they're getting calls from activist investors about how they've performed against benchmarking, public benchmarking studies and things like that. So
that's the sort of holding to account, etc., and that verification that's coming through. Brilliant. Thanks, Susan. James, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Emma.
A difficult one for me because yeah, I'm a bit of a newcomer, but I think it's for me it's I think a realization that everyone can have a part, and nobody's contribution is not worthwhile, and it all has value. But I would also say, and it's something that lots of people have said before, but when people say that there's no competition with safety, with the health and safety, and we should all work together, I think the same could be said of ESG issues. It's not a competition. What we're trying to do is enhance and improve for everyone. And why not? Because there is no competition.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, James. Emma, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Paul.
Single issue, I think, is pretty.
Oh, have we just lost Emma? We'll come back to Emma in a second. Paul, straight on to yourself, sir.
Okay. Well, the tool, I mentioned it already.
Changing the way that we sort of talk about.
Oh.
Okay. Keep going, Paul, and we'll just quickly.
All right. Yeah, that was a bit unusual. Scenario analysis is the tool, and I make a distinction between the generation of technical scenarios, lots of different temperatures and implications, and the translation of scenarios into action. And I think in the second bit is the key bit, the less understood bit, where anybody can get involved, because we can all think about how this might affect us within organizations, but more widely as well. So look at the different, dealing with uncertainty, looking at different futures and deciding what we want.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Paul. Emma, we're going to try you again because you froze. Don't worry, you still look beautiful when you froze. It wasn't one of these nasty ones. But let's come to you for your comments. And then we're going to go to Ian.
Yeah, I think picking a single issue is hard. I would say that we shouldn't underestimate the value of sort of legislation in this. That I think we've kind of talked a lot about how companies are kind of setting ESG dynamics, how investors, how all these parties are kind of affecting it. But fundamentally, I'd like to be, I think, hearing a bit more about how citizens in a country are setting ESG requirements and how the government's kind of translating that into legislation. I think I'd like to see the citizens of a country and the governments of a country kind of be more involved, at least, than I think they are now in ESG conversations, and kind of possibly see that sort of translate or effectively translate through to legislation. Because I think, sometimes we kind of lose in this, that who is setting this conversation for who, who is telling the people of Malawi that their social benefits are being set by BlackRock. I don't, there's something in there that I think we could benefit more from. I think everybody just working more collaboratively in this space than sort of, everybody bringing their own individual thoughts to the table, which are valuable, but probably more valuable if we're all kind of doing it collectively.
So it's a collaborative moving forward rather than, I guess, the opposite, which is everybody stepping back and expecting somebody else to do it as well, which would not be a good way of thinking. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Emma. Ian, let's come to yourself next, and then we'll go to Elaine.
Well, I'm going to have to go with communication. It's that shift for people-centered communications, switching away from the conveyancing of matters of fact that we've been so expert in, or I think we have for so long, to developing authentic dialogues around matters of concern. That's what I'd go for.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ian. Elaine, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Kat.
Well, I hesitate to say there's a single tool that will make the biggest change in the ESG world, but the TCFD modeling exercise is significant in the way it's getting companies to think. But I think the biggest thing that's happened recently, is investors taking an interest finally in the fact that social and environmental performance not only will lead to better financial performance, but helps manage and mitigate risk. And shining a bright light on that in a way that demands companies to respond and measure and disclose in a more quantitative and holistic way, I think has been able to shift the conversation and is going to shift performance. And I just think that is significant. I think you can't wait on governments and regulation, that you have to be ahead of that and pushing on that from other stakeholder vantage points.
Yeah, no, definitely. I totally agree with you on that. I think there has been a big step change actually since finance kind of came to the table in a bigger way. And then, yes, and regulation often in many things sometimes lags a little bit, perhaps, in terms of just that timing, but it shouldn't be an excuse to wait for that regulation, etc. So I guess to Emma's comment as well there. Brilliant. Thank you, Elaine. And Kat, how about yourself?
I'd say education, because, and that's not just thinking about school age university, that's education throughout the whole, both industry and externally around this. And I think that will lead to empowerment of everyone to make good decisions, because ultimately activation comes from decisions that every individual makes. And if collectively all those decisions are informed by a good base of education within this space, then collectively that will have the biggest impact. But I suppose that's a bit of a escape from thinking of one tool, because I think that captures actually pretty much what everyone has said. But I couldn't distill it to one, because it is very much a collaboration that we can achieve together.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Kat. So I am not surprised at all that people have found it difficult to pick on the one tool, because of course this is something that needs lots and lots of tools. And certainly when the organising group that were putting together this conference started thinking about that infographic, you can see that infographic has just grown and grown and grown with all of these different tools, tips, tricks, techniques, approaches that perhaps needs to be in place to ensure that we see this responsibility really coming into our raw materials as a whole. Now I can see there is some fantastic commentary going on in chat. Chat has just gone mad, which is brilliant. So thank you very much, everybody. Keep that chat coming. Keep the Q&As coming. This is, so we've only just scratched the surface. Okay, so this is the first of many sections of this conference. And tomorrow, so tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. UK time. So for those of you who I am sure watching on the recorded video from Australia, because at the moment you should hopefully be fast asleep. So tomorrow morning, hopefully you'll be able to dial in live. Tomorrow we're going to actually start to hear from people like Hugo Brody from the London Metal Exchange. So where do they view things like ESG? We're going to be speaking with Victor Carrera, Ruth Allington, a whole variety of different aspects that we're going to be considering here from a wealth of different people coming at ESG within raw materials from different perspectives. So that will all be tomorrow morning. And then in tomorrow afternoon, we've got Lucy Crane and Ben Lepley really looking at the public perception of mining. So I suspect building on some of what Ian has perhaps spoken about today, through into finishing off with looking at mining for the triple bottom line. So this is going to be an interactive session with Catherine McCallum and friends, shall I say, with regards to that. So really looking at trying to get some of this ESG tools to really work. And that's just Tuesday. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, this goes on until Friday. Please do feel free to dip in and out of the conference, because we do know that there's a huge amount of time that needs to be invested into it. Everything is being recorded, and where possible, we will also be posting all of these lovely links that people have been sharing with us in the chat. We will be sharing those as well through the website. Two final things. Kat mentioned earlier on training, for example, and making sure that our young professionals get the training that they require to ensure that actually we do push the industry forward in a responsible way. As mentioned at the beginning of today, there are 3 training courses on which we've had lots and lots of sponsorship that's come in, which is great. We could do with some more sponsorship, so there's a hint. All the sponsorship goes to paying for people to get free seats on the training courses. So if you're interested in either sponsoring or coming on the training course, have a little look at the webpage, and also email Ellen at ellen@satala.com, and she'll be able to sort you out, hopefully with a space. And if not, she'll be able to give you more information on that. Also, secondly, there is our challenge, and yes, there will be prizes for this. Last year, we invited you all to draw a picture of a mine. So what do you think a mine looked like? This year, we're asking you to draw a picture of what do you think a responsible mining operation looks like. These pictures can be drawn on the back of envelopes, on the back of bills. It can be drawn on your computer and sent in. It doesn't matter. They can be drawn in sand on the beach. There's a nice sustainable way of doing it. Send them in to us at hello@responsiblerawmaterials.com, because that really allows us to actually understand the different perspectives and perceptions of what mining should really be looking like, and how do we make materials and raw materials all the more responsible. Now I'm looking at Rose, who is the organizing genius that sits behind this conference. Is there anything else I need to say, Rose? She's shaking her head. I think I'm okay. I'm 2 minutes over on our time for today. But ladies and gentlemen, I know that you've got questions that we haven't managed to answer. We will endeavour to answer them as we go through the course of this week. But please join me in putting your hands together for one final massive round of applause, and thank you to our fabulous speakers who have been with us for this session. Thank you very, very much. And ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. British summertime or UK time. Yes, don't worry, Elaine and Susan, we won't expect you guys to be getting up for that. And then our second session tomorrow starts at the same time again, so 3 p.m. UK time tomorrow afternoon. Everything's being recorded so you can catch up on those videos. But thank you very much, ladies and gents. Have a lovely evening, rest of your day or morning, depending on where you are, and see you shortly. Thank you very much.